In the beginning there was only silence between two rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates carved their ancient paths through endless sand, carrying the dreams of gods and the whispers of eternity. Here, where the world's first dawn broke over marshland and reed, where the very concept of civilization stirred in the fertile mud, kings would rise whose names echo still through time's endless corridors. These were not merely rulers of men, but shepherds of humanity's infancy, wielders of divine mandate, bearers of the first crowns ever forged. In this cradle of memory, where cuneiform first captured human thought and ziggurats reached toward heaven, the legendary kings of Sumer began their eternal reign over both history and legend, their stories flowing like the rivers themselves, timeless, powerful, and forever. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. The story of Sumer begins not with kings or crowns, but with the slow, patient rhythm of water against earth. For millennia before the first human settlements, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers had carved their serpentine paths through the heart of what would become Mesopotamia, depositing layers of rich alluvium across the vast plain that stretched toward the Persian Gulf. This was a land born from the marriage of water and soil, where the annual floods brought both destruction and renewal, where the boundary between river and marsh shifted with the seasons like the border between dream and waking. In the earliest days, perhaps around 6,500 BCE, the first hunters and gatherers discovered this fertile crescent of possibility. They found a landscape unlike any other, vast reed beds that whispered in the wind, channels that changed course with each flood, and soil so rich it seemed to pulse with life itself. The summer heat was merciless, baking the earth until it cracked like broken pottery, while winter brought cool respites when the rivers ran lower and the land could breathe. But it was the spring floods that defined this place, transforming the entire region into a vast inland sea dotted with islands of higher ground, where palm trees swayed and wild grasses grew in abundance. The people who first called this land home were not yet Sumerians. That identity would emerge slowly, like sediment settling in still water. They were diverse tribes who shared the challenge of surviving in an environment that was both generous and capricious. The rivers provided fish, waterfowl, and transportation, while the marshes offered reeds for building and wild grains for sustenance. But the floods that brought life also brought danger, washing away settlements and forcing constant adaptation. It was here, in this dialogue between human ingenuity and natural force, that the first seeds of civilization were planted. As generations passed, these early inhabitants learned to read the moods of their watery world. They discovered that the floods followed patterns, that certain lands were more stable than others, that cooperation was essential for survival. They began to cluster their settlements on the natural levees and elevated areas, creating the first permanent communities. These villages, scattered across the alluvial plain like stars in a vast night sky, would eventually grow into the great cities of Sumer, Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, and Kish. But it was Eridu, according to the most ancient traditions, that held the distinction of being the first city, the place where divine kingship was first lowered from heaven. Located near the confluence of the two great rivers, Eridu occupied a position of both practical and spiritual significance. Here, where the fresh waters met the salt marshes, where the boundary between the civilized world and the primordial chaos was thinnest, the first temple was built to Enki, the god of wisdom and the deep waters. The Temple of Eridu was no grand structure in its earliest form, merely a simple shrine built of mud, brick and reed, elevated on a platform above the floodline. But it represented something revolutionary, the idea that the divine could be housed, that the forces of nature could be approached through ritual and offering, that human beings could serve as intermediaries between the earthly and celestial realms. This temple, rebuilt and enlarged over countless generations, would become the prototype for all Mesopotamian religious architecture, the ancestor of the great ziggurats that would later dominate the landscape. Around this sacred centre, the first true city began to take shape. Houses clustered near the temple, their walls built from the same mud bricks that had been used since time immemorial. Streets, if they could be called that, meandered between the buildings like tributaries of a great river. Wells were dug to provide fresh water during the dry seasons, while raised platforms protected the most important structures from the annual floods. This was urban planning in its most primitive form, but it represented a profound shift in human consciousness. The recognition that people could live together permanently, that specialization was possible, that some individuals could dedicate their lives to serving the gods while others provided for their material needs. As Eridu grew, so did its influence over the surrounding region. The city became a center of trade, drawing merchants from distant lands who came to exchange goods and ideas. The temple workshops produced fine pottery, metalwork, and textiles that were prized throughout the ancient world. Scribes began to develop the earliest forms of writing, using simple pictographs to record transactions and temple offerings. These clay tablets, baked hard by the sun or fire, would preserve the memory of these early achievements for millennia to come. The emergence of writing marked a crucial turning point in human history. For the first time, knowledge could be preserved beyond the limitations of human memory, passed down through generations without the distortions inevitable in oral tradition. The earliest tablets from Eridu and other Sumerian cities contain mundane records, lists of livestock, measurements of grain, accounts of temple offerings. But they also represent something profound, the birth of history itself, the moment when human beings began to create a permanent record of their achievements and failures, their hopes and fears. As the 4th millennium BCE progressed, other settlements began to follow Eridu's example. Uruk, located further up the Euphrates, grew to even greater prominence, its massive walls eventually enclosing an area that could house tens of thousands of inhabitants. Strategically positioned near the Persian Gulf, became a centre of maritime trade. Lagash, nestled between the two rivers, developed into a powerful city-state with influence over vast agricultural territories. Each city developed its own character, its own patron deities, its own distinctive culture, but all shared the fundamental innovations that had first emerged in Eridu. The rise of these cities transformed the entire region. The scattered tribes of earlier times gradually coalesced into a unified culture that scholars would later call Sumerian. They shared a common language, a common writing system, and a common set of religious beliefs centered on the worship of a pantheon of deities who controlled the forces of nature. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems that allowed them to harness the power of the rivers, turning the desert into a garden. They created the first known legal codes, establishing principles of justice and social order that would influence civilization for millennia to come. But perhaps most importantly, they developed the institution of kingship, the idea that divine authority could be embodied in a human ruler who served as the earthly representative of the gods. This concept would prove to be one of the most durable and influential innovations in human history, shaping the development of civilization from ancient times to the present day. The kings of Sumer were not merely political leaders, they were sacred figures who bridged the gap between the human and divine realms, whose actions determined the fate of both their subjects and the land itself. In the misty depths of Sumerian memory, before the boundaries between myth and history had hardened into stone, there existed a time when the gods themselves walked among mortals, when the first kings were not merely chosen by heaven, but were divine beings who had descended to rule the earth. This was the antediluvian period, the age before the great flood that would reset the world and establish the order of civilization as later generations knew it. It was a time of wonder and terror, when the normal laws of nature seemed suspended, when kings could rule for tens of thousands of years, when the very fabric of reality was different from what would come after. The Sumerian king list, that remarkable document compiled by scribes of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, begins with these words. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. These simple statements contain within them the entire cosmology of ancient Mesopotamia. The belief that legitimate authority came from the gods, that the first city was Eridu, and that the first king was Alulim, a figure so ancient that his very name seems to echo with primordial power. Alulim represents something unique in the annals of human history. The first king, the prototype of all royal authority, the original bridge between heaven and earth. Unlike the historical rulers who would follow, Alulim was not a mortal man who achieved greatness through conquest or political skill. He was a divine being, or at least a being so close to the gods that the distinction was meaningless. The extraordinary length of his reign, 28,800 years, was not hyperbole but a reflection of his divine nature. Time moved differently in the antediluvian world, and beings who partook of divine essence were not subject to the limitations of mortal existence. The city over which Alulim ruled was itself a place of wonder. Eridu in this primordial age was not yet the mud-brick settlement that archaeologists would later uncover, but a city that existed at the intersection of the physical and spiritual worlds. Its temple was the dwelling place of Enki, the god of wisdom and the abyss, and its king was the direct representative of divine will on earth. The very act of ruling was a form of worship, a sacred duty that required the king to maintain the harmony between the celestial and terrestrial realms. After Alulim's impossibly long reign came to an end, the kingship passed to Alangar, who ruled for 36,000 years. Even less is known about this second king of Eridu, but his reign too was marked by the same divine attributes that characterized the antediluvian period. The pattern established by these first two rulers, extraordinarily long reigns, direct divine authority, and the sacred nature of kingship, would define the entire pre-flood period in Sumerian memory. The king list records that after Alangar, Eridu fell, the kingship was taken to Bad Tibera. This simple statement marks one of the most significant transitions in mythical history. Bad Tibera, the city of the metal workers, became the second seat of divine kingship, and with it came new innovations and new challenges. The king of Bad Tibera was Enmenluana, who ruled for 43,200 years. His name, which means Lord of the Divine Powers of Heaven, suggests that he was associated with the celestial realm, and perhaps with the development of the arts and sciences that would later define civilization. Enmenluana was followed by Enmengalana, who ruled for 28,800 years, and then by Dumuzid the Eye Shepherd, who ruled for 36,000 years. This last figure is particularly significant because Dumuzid, also known as Tammuz, would later become one of the most important deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon, associated with fertility, death, and rebirth. The fact that he appears in the king list as both a historical ruler and a mythological figure illustrates the fluid boundary between human and divine in Sumerian thought. The kingship then moved to Larak, where Ensipadsidana ruled for 28,800 years. Little is known about this city or its king, but the pattern continues. Impossibly long reigns, divine authority, and the sacred nature of royal power. The same pattern holds for Sippar, where Enmenduana ruled for 21,000 years, and for Shuruppak, where Ubaratutu, the hero of the flood story, ruled for 18,600 years. Ubaratutu occupies a special place in Sumerian mythology because he was the last of the antediluvian kings, the final ruler before the great flood that would transform the world. According to the epic traditions, it was Ubaratutu's son Utnapishtim, known as Ziusudra in Sumerian, who was chosen by the gods to survive the flood and preserve humanity for the post-Diluvian age. The story of this flood, which would later influence the biblical account of Noah, represents the end of the mythical age and the beginning of the historical period. The flood itself was not merely a natural disaster, but a cosmic event that reset the relationship between gods and mortals. The antediluvian world had become corrupt. Its inhabitants had forgotten their proper place in the divine order, and the gods decided to cleanse the earth and begin again. But they chose to preserve one righteous man and his family, along with representatives of all living creatures, to seed the new world that would emerge from the waters. When the flood finally receded, the world was fundamentally changed. The direct connection between heaven and earth had been severed, and kingship had to be lowered from heaven once again. But this time it would take a different form. The new kings would be mortal men, chosen by the gods but not divine themselves. Their reigns would be measured in years rather than millennia, and their authority would depend on their ability to maintain the favour of the gods through proper ritual and just governance. The king list records that after the flood, the kingship was lowered from heaven and established first in Kish, then in Uruk, then in Ur, and so on through the various cities of Sumer. This post-flood period marks the beginning of what modern historians consider the historical period, when the archaeological record begins to confirm the existence of actual rulers, and when the fantastic elements of the earlier stories give way to more plausible accounts of human achievement and failure. Yet even in this new dispensation, the memory of the antediluvian kings continued to exert a powerful influence on Sumerian culture. They were remembered as the golden age of kingship, when rulers were truly divine and when the harmony between heaven and earth was perfect. Later kings would claim descent from these mythical figures, and the ideal of divine kingship would continue to shape Mesopotamian politics for millennia to come. As the mythical age gave way to the dawn of recorded history, the landscape of Sumer began to transform in ways that would define civilization for millennia to come. The scattered settlements that had dotted the alluvial plain for generations began to coalesce into true cities, each with its own character, its own patron deity, and its own emerging traditions of governance. These were not merely larger versions of the villages that had preceded them. They represented a fundamental shift in human social organization, the birth of urban civilization as we know it. The transition from the antediluvian to the historical period was not abrupt but gradual, like the slow change of seasons. The flood that marked the end of the mythical age was both a catastrophe and a renewal, washing away the old order while preparing the ground for new growth. As the waters receded, the survivors emerged to find a world that was familiar yet transformed, where the ancient cities had to be rebuilt and the relationship between gods and mortals had to be renegotiated. Eridu, though it had been the first city and the original seat of divine kingship, found itself diminished in the new age. The great temple of Enki remained, rebuilt and enlarged over the centuries, but the political centre of gravity had shifted northward. The city that would dominate the early historical period was not the ancient seat of Alulim, but the rising power of Uruk, located on the Euphrates River about 40 miles northwest of Eridu. Uruk in the early 4th millennium BCE was a city of unprecedented size and complexity. Its walls, according to later legend, enclosed an area of more than 2 square miles, making it the largest urban centre the world had yet seen. Within those walls lived tens of thousands of people, engaged in a dizzying array of occupations that would have been impossible in the smaller settlements of earlier times. There were farmers and herders, of course, but also potters and metal workers, scribes and priests, merchants and soldiers, each contributing their specialized skills to the collective life of the city. The heart of Uruk was its temple complex, dominated by the great ziggurat dedicated to Anu, the sky god, and Inanna, the goddess of love and war. This massive structure, built from millions of mud bricks and rising in terrace stages toward the heavens, was not merely a religious building, but a statement of the city's power and ambition. It declared to all who saw it that Uruk was favoured by the gods, that its rulers possessed divine authority, and that the city itself was a bridge between the earthly and celestial realms. The emergence of such monumental architecture required not only massive, resources but also sophisticated organizational skills. The construction of the ziggurat would have involved thousands of workers laboring for years under the direction of skilled architects and engineers. The logistics of feeding, housing, and coordinating such a workforce demanded administrative systems of unprecedented complexity. It was this organizational challenge that drove many of the innovations that would define urban civilization: the development of writing to keep records, the creation of standardized weights and measures, the establishment of specialized bureaucracies to manage different aspects of the city's life. The rulers who oversaw this transformation were no longer the divine beings of the antediluvian period, but mortal men who claimed divine sanction for their authority. The title they bore was En, which meant lord or ruler, and it carried with it both political and religious significance. The En of Uruk was not merely a secular administrator, but a sacred figure who served as the earthly representative of the city's patron deities. His palace was adjacent to the temple, and his duties included not only governing the city but also performing the rituals that maintained the god's favour. Among the earliest rulers of Uruk whose names have survived in the historical record was Enmerkar, a figure who stands at the boundary between myth and history. The epic traditions describe him as the founder of Uruk's greatness, the king who established the city's dominance over the surrounding region and who first extended its influence to distant lands. His very name, which means Enma the Hunter, suggests a ruler who was skilled in both war and the chase, qualities that would have been essential for a leader in the turbulent early historical period. Enmerkar's reign marked the beginning of what scholars call the Uruk period, a time when the city's influence spread far beyond its walls. Archaeological evidence suggests that Uruk established trading posts and colonies throughout Mesopotamia and into neighbouring regions, creating the first known trade network of truly international scope. This expansion was driven not only by the city's growing population and resource needs, but also by its development of new technologies and techniques that gave it significant advantages over its rivals. One of the most important of these innovations was the potter's wheel, which revolutionized ceramic production and allowed for the mass production of standardized vessels. Another was the development of the sailboat, which made river transport far more efficient and enabled the long-distance trade that would become essential to the city's prosperity. But perhaps most important was the refinement of writing, which evolved from the simple pictographs of earlier times into a more sophisticated system capable of recording complex transactions, legal agreements, and administrative decisions. The legendary successor to Enmerkar was Lugalbanda, known as the Shepherd, whose reign is remembered in epic poetry as a time of great adventures and divine favour. Unlike his predecessor, whose epithet emphasised his skills as a hunter and warrior, Lugalbanda was associated with the pastoral life and the care of flocks. This suggests a ruler who was concerned not only with conquest and expansion, but also with the welfare of his people and the proper management of the city's resources. The epic traditions describe Lugalbanda as a figure blessed by the gods, particularly by the great bird Anzu, who granted him supernatural speed and the ability to travel vast distances. These stories, while clearly mythological, may preserve memories of a ruler who was particularly skilled at diplomacy and communication, who maintained Uruk's far-flung trade networks through personal relationships and careful negotiation rather than military force alone. During this period, other cities were also rising to prominence throughout Sumer. Ur, located near the Persian Gulf, became a major centre of maritime trade, its merchants venturing into the Gulf and beyond to establish commercial relationships with distant lands. The city's wealth is attested by the famous royal cemetery of Ur, where archaeologists have uncovered elaborate burial goods including golden helmets, jewellery, and musical instruments that speak to a level of craftsmanship and artistic achievement that rivals any in the ancient world. Lagash, positioned between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, developed into a powerful agricultural centre whose rulers controlled vast irrigation systems that brought fertility to the surrounding countryside. The city's archives, preserved on thousands of clay tablets, provide detailed records of its administration and give us our clearest picture of how these early city-states were governed. The rulers of Lagash bore the title Ensi, which meant governor or steward, reflecting their role as administrators of the god's earthly domain. Nippur, though smaller than some of its neighbours, held a special position in the Sumerian world as the religious centre of the pantheon. Here stood the great temple of Enlil, the god of air and storms, who was considered the king of the gods and the source of all legitimate authority. The rulers of other cities would come to Nippur to receive divine sanction for their rule, and the city's priests played a crucial role in maintaining the religious unity that bound the diverse city-states of Sumer together. Each of these cities developed its own distinctive culture and traditions, but they all shared certain fundamental characteristics that defined Sumerian civilization. They were all centered around temple complexes that served as both religious and economic centers. They all developed sophisticated irrigation systems that allowed them to support large populations in an arid environment. They all created administrative systems based on writing that enabled them to manage complex societies, and they all were ruled by kings who claimed divine authority and who saw their primary role as maintaining the favor of the gods. The rise of these cities was not without conflict. As they grew in size and power, they inevitably came into competition with one another for resources, trade routes, and political influence. The early historical period was marked by almost constant warfare between the city-states, as rulers sought to expand their territories and assert their dominance over their neighbours. This competition drove further innovations in military technology and tactics, as well as in the diplomatic arts that sometimes offered alternatives to armed conflict. Despite these conflicts, or perhaps because of them, the cities of Sumer continued to flourish and grow. The competitive environment encouraged innovation and prevented any single city from becoming so dominant that it stifled the development of the others. The result was a dynamic civilization that produced remarkable achievements in art, literature, law, and technology, laying the foundations for all subsequent developments in human civilization. As the 4th millennium BCE drew to a close and the 3rd millennium began, the scattered city-states of Sumer underwent a profound transformation that would reshape the nature of political power and social organization throughout the ancient world. The transition from the Age of the Ends, the priest-kings who ruled through divine authority, to the Age of the Lugals, the warrior kings who ruled through military might, marked a fundamental shift in the character of Mesopotamian civilization. This was the dawn of kingship as we understand it today. Secular, militaristic, and expansionist. The word Lugal literally means great man or big man, and it originally referred to a war leader who was chosen by the assembly of free citizens to lead them in times of crisis. Unlike the Ien, whose authority was permanent and religiously sanctioned, the Lugal was supposed to be a temporary figure who would relinquish his power once the emergency had passed. But as the conflicts between city-states intensified and became more frequent, the distinction between wartime and peacetime began to blur, and many Lugals found ways to make their authority permanent. One of the earliest and most significant of these warrior kings was Gilgamesh of Uruk, whose reign around 2700 BCE marked the beginning of a new era in Mesopotamian history. Gilgamesh is perhaps the most famous figure from ancient Mesopotamia, thanks to the epic poems that celebrated his adventures and achievements. But behind the mythological stories lies a historical figure who transformed not only his own city, but the entire concept of kingship in the ancient world. The historical Gilgamesh was the 5th king of Uruk's first dynasty, according to the Sumerian king list, and his reign of 126 years, while clearly exaggerated, suggests a ruler of exceptional longevity and achievement. He was remembered as the king who built the great walls of Uruk, who established his city's dominance over the surrounding region, and who extended Uruk's influence to distant lands through conquest and diplomacy. But more than his specific achievements, Gilgamesh represented a new type of ruler, one who combined the religious authority of the traditional En with the military prowess of the Lugal. The stories about Gilgamesh, as they have come down to us in the great epic that bears his name, portray him as a figure of almost superhuman strength and courage who undertook mighty deeds that no ordinary mortal could accomplish. He slew the monster Humbaba in the cedar forest. He defeated the bull of heaven sent by the goddess Ishtar, and he journeyed to the ends of the earth in search of immortality. These tales, while clearly mythological, reflect the real achievements of a ruler who expanded the boundaries of what was possible for human beings to accomplish.
The reign of Gilgamesh also marked the beginning of what scholars call the early dynastic period, a time when the city-states of Sumer reached new heights of power and sophistication. This was the age of the great temple complexes, of the first monumental sculpture, of the development of cylinder seals that served as both artistic masterpieces and administrative tools. It was also the age of the first great military campaigns, as the rulers of the various city-states sought to expand their territories and assert their dominance over their neighbors. The nature of warfare itself was changing during this period. The earlier conflicts between city-states had been relatively small-scale affairs, involving citizen soldiers who fought when necessary but returned to their farms and workshops when the crisis passed. But the new warrior kings maintained professional armies of skilled soldiers who were equipped with bronze weapons and who fought in disciplined formations. The development of the war chariot, pulled by onagers' wild donkeys, gave these armies greater mobility and striking power than ever before. Most vivid evidence of this new military culture comes from the archaeological record, particularly from the famous Standard of Yore, which depicts scenes of both war and peace from around 2600 BC. The war side shows disciplined troops marching in formation, carrying spears and shields, while chariots charge ahead of them. The peace side shows the celebration that follows victory, with figures bringing tribute and participating in ceremonial feasts together. These images capture the dual nature of the new kingship, the ability to wage war effectively, and the wisdom to enjoy the fruits of victory won. Of the most successful of these early warrior kings was Enetum of Lagash, who ruled around 2450 BCE and created what may have been the first territorial empire in human history, unlike his predecessors, who had been content to raid neighboring cities and extract tribute. Enetum set out to conquer and permanently occupy the territories of his enemies. His victories were commemorated in the famous stele of the vultures, which shows the king leading his troops into battle and depicts the aftermath of victory with gruesome scenes of vultures feasting on the bodies of the defeated. The inscriptions on the stele describe Enetum's conquest of Umma, Lagash's traditional enemy, and his extension of Lagash's control over a vast territory that included parts of Elam to the east, and possibly even regions as far away as the Mediterranean coast. For the first time in history, a single ruler controlled not just a city and its immediate surroundings, but a vast network of territories that stretched across much of the known world. This was the prototype of all later empires, the first example of the expansionist state that would dominate world history for millennia to come. The success of rulers like Enetum was made possible by innovations in military technology and organization, but it also reflected deeper changes in the nature of political authority. The new warrior kings were not content to serve as the earthly representatives of the gods. They claimed divine status for themselves and demanded to be worshipped as gods during their lifetimes. This transformation of royal ideology would have profound implications for the future development of monarchy throughout the ancient world. Divine kingship that emerged during this period was different from the religious authority of the earlier Ens, where the En had been the servant of the gods. The Lugaltan god was their equal or even their superior. The king was no longer merely the steward of the temple's lands. He was the owner of all land and all people within his domain. This concentration of power in the hands of a single individual created new possibilities for large-scale organization and achievement, but it also created new dangers and instabilities that would plague Mesopotamian civilization for centuries to come. The rise of divine kingship was accompanied by the development of more sophisticated administrative systems. The need to govern large territories and diverse populations required new methods of record-keeping, new techniques for collecting taxes and tribute, and new ways of coordinating the activities of distant provinces. The scribal schools that had developed to serve the temples now expanded to train the bureaucrats who would staff the royal administration. The legal systems that had grown up to regulate local disputes now had to be adapted to handle the complexities of imperial governance. One of the most remarkable innovations of this period was the development of the first known law code. Associated with Ur-Nammu of Ur around 2100 BCE, this code, inscribed on clay tablets, established standardized punishments for various crimes and created a system of justice that was supposed to apply equally to all subjects of the king. The very existence of such a code reflects the new complexity of Mesopotamian society and the need for systematic approaches to governance that could handle the challenges of ruling diverse populations over vast territories. The early dynastic period also saw remarkable achievements in art and literature that reflected the new royal ideology. The great sculptures of this era, such as the votive statues from the temple of Abu at Tel Asma, show figures with enormous eyes that seem to gaze eternally toward the divine realm. The literature of the period, preserved in epic poems and hymns, celebrates the achievements of kings who bridged the gap between earth and heaven, who accomplished deeds that no ordinary mortal could achieve. But perhaps the most significant development of this period was the creation of the first historical records, in the modern sense, the Sumerian king list. Compiled during the third dynasty of Ur, represents the first systematic attempt to create a chronological record of political events. While the list includes many mythological and legendary figures, it also preserves the names and achievements of historical rulers whose existence can be confirmed by archaeological evidence. This marks the beginning of historical consciousness as we understand it today. The recognition that the past is different from the present and that the actions of previous generations have shaped the world we inherit. As the early dynastic period progressed, the competition between city-states intensified, leading to larger and more destructive wars. The technological innovations that had given individual cities advantages over their neighbors were quickly adopted by their rivals, creating an arms race that drove further developments in military technology and tactics. The professional armies grew larger and more expensive, requiring ever greater resources to maintain. The burden of supporting these military forces fell increasingly on the agricultural population, leading to social tensions that would eventually contribute to the transformation of Mesopotamian society. The conflicts of this period were not merely about territorial expansion or economic resources. They were also about prestige and divine favor. Each city-state claimed that its patron deity was supreme, and that its king was the rightful ruler of all Sumer. These religious and political claims were mutually reinforcing, creating a cycle of conflict that would continue for centuries. The wars of the early dynastic period were thus not merely political struggles, but cosmic battles between rival divine orders, divine warfare, or perhaps because of it, the cities of Sumer continued to flourish and innovate. The competitive environment encouraged rapid development of new technologies and techniques. While the need to coordinate military campaigns drove improvements in administration and communication, the result was a civilization of remarkable dynamism and creativity, one that would lay the foundations for all subsequent developments in human civilization. As the 3rd millennium BCE reached its midpoint, the stage was set for the next great transformation in Mesopotamian history. The city-states of Sumer, having reached the limits of their individual expansion, were about to face a new challenge from the north, where a different people with a different language and different political traditions were beginning to assert their dominance over the region. This encounter would produce the first true empire in human history and would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the story of Mesopotamian civilization. The seeds of this transformation were already being sown in the northern cities, where Semitic-speaking peoples who had migrated from the Arabian Peninsula were beginning to adopt and adapt Sumerian culture. These newcomers brought with them new ideas about political organization and military tactics, as well as new technologies and new approaches to trade and diplomacy. The fusion of these different traditions would create a synthesis that would dominate the ancient world for centuries to come. In the city of Kish, which had long been a center of Sumerian civilization, a new type of ruler was emerging. These kings combined the religious authority of the traditional Sumerian with the military prowess of the Lugal. But they also possessed something new: the ability to appeal to peoples of different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds, and to unite them under a common banner. This synthesis of different traditions would soon produce a ruler who would transform not only Mesopotamia, but the entire ancient world. The name of this ruler was Sargon, and his rise to power would mark the end of the age of the independent city-states and the beginning of the age of empire. But before that momentous transformation could occur, the traditional Sumerian world would experience one final flowering. As the city-states reached new heights of achievement and sophistication, the stage was set for the climactic events that would bring the early dynastic period to a close and usher in a new era in the history of human civilization. The rulers of this final phase of Sumerian independence were acutely aware that they were living in a time of transition, that the old order was passing away and something new was about to be born there. Inscriptions speak of divine mandates and cosmic responsibilities, of the need to preserve the traditions of the ancestors while adapting to the challenges of a changing world. They were the last of the great Sumerian kings, the final guardians of a civilization that had given birth to writing, to law, to urban life, and to the very concept of civilization itself. These final Sumerian rulers contemplated their legacy. They could not have imagined that their achievements would influence human civilization for thousands of years to come. The innovations they had pioneered, writing law, urban planning, monumental architecture, professional armies, centralized government, would spread throughout the ancient world and become the foundation of all subsequent civilizations. The stories of their reigns, preserved in epic poetry and historical records, would continue to inspire rulers and subjects alike long after their kingdoms had fallen and their cities had been abandoned to the sand. The twilight of the Sumerian city-states was approaching, but it would be a twilight filled with glory and achievement. As the final generation of independent Sumerian rulers strove to create monuments that would preserve their memory for eternity, the great ziggurats, the elaborate palaces, the sophisticated works of art and literature that characterized this period were all, in their way, attempts to achieve a kind of immortality, to ensure that the achievements of Sumerian civilization would not be forgotten when the political order that had created them finally passed away in the end. These efforts would succeed beyond their creators' wildest dreams. The civilization of Sumer would indeed achieve a kind of immortality, not through the preservation of its political institutions, but through the enduring influence of its cultural achievements. The legacy of the legendary kings of Sumer would live on in the civilizations that followed, shaping the development of human society in ways that continue to influence our world today. The sacred waters carried more than silt and promise. They carried the dreams of mortals who dared to shape eternity itself in the silence between dawn and memory. The first cities rose like prayers carved in clay, each brick a testament to the divine spark that separated kings from dust. When the great waters receded and the earth remembered its purpose, the city of Kish emerged from the fertile darkness like a jewel set in the crown of creation here, where the rivers had once converged in their primordial dance. The first dynasty after the flood would take root not as conquerors, but as the chosen vessels of divine Wiltha. Kings of Kish understood something their predecessors had forgotten. Power was not seized but bestowed, not claimed but inherited through the sacred lineage that connected mortal flesh to immortal purpose. Their names would echo through the millennia not because they conquered cities, but because they conquered the very concept of legitimacy itself. Giora, the first king of the restored world, ruled for 900 years, a span that encompassed the childhood of civilization itself. His reign was marked not by the clash of bronze against bronze, but by the gentle persistence of order imposed upon chaos in his time. The art of writing transformed from sacred mystery to common tool, and the first laws were carved not in stone, but in the hearts of men who understood that justice was the foundation upon which all kingdoms must stand. The palace of Goyor rose from the earth like a mountain born of human will, its walls thick enough to withstand not just the siege engines of enemies, but the erosion of time itself. Here, in chambers lit by oil lamps that burned with the consistency of stars, the king would hold court with the wisdom of ages, his voice carrying the authority of one who had seen the world remade and knew the price of forgetting the lessons written in flood and fire. Yet, even as Goyor established the foundations of kingship, he understood that true power lay not in the fear of subjects, but in their love. He walked among his people not as a god among mortals, but as a shepherd among his flock. His presence a reminder that leadership was service, and service was the highest form of worship. The fields around Kish flourished under his care, the barley growing tall and golden, the date palms heavy with fruit that tasted of sunshine and promise. When death came for Goya, it came not as conquest, but as completion. The king had lived to see his city become the center of a world reborn, his dynasty secure in the knowledge that he had built not just on earth, but for eternity. His son, Gulanida Banapad, inherited not just a throne, but a legacy written in the very stones of the city, each building a verse in the epic of human ambition guided by divine wisdom. The second king of Kish ruled for 840 years, and in that time the city grew from a cluster of buildings around a temple to a true metropolis, its streets paved with stones that had been blessed by priests and polished by the feet of pilgrims who came from distant lands to witness the miracle of ordered society. The markets of Kish became legendary, not just for the goods they offered, but for the fairness of their transactions, the honesty of their merchants, and the wisdom of their judges. Under Gulanida Bar Napad's reign, the first schools were established, places where the sons of nobles and commoners alike could learn the sacred art of writing, the mysteries of mathematics, and the principles of governance that would serve them whether they became scribes in the palace or farmers in the fields. The king himself would often visit these centers of learning, his presence a reminder that knowledge was the most precious gift a ruler could give to his people, the third king of the dynasty. Zukukip brought with him a different kind of wisdom where his predecessors had focused on building and teaching. He understood that a kingdom's strength lay not just in its walls, but in its connections to the world beyond during his 900 years of rule. The first trade routes were established, paths that would carry not just goods, but ideas, not just wealth, but the seeds of cultural exchange that would transform the ancient world. Caravans from Kish would venture into the mountains, seeking precious stones and metals, while merchants from distant lands would arrive at the city gates with goods that seemed to carry the essence of foreign skies. The king's court became a place where languages mingled like streams feeding a great river, where customs from a dozen different peoples were examined, adapted, and woven into the ever-growing tapestry of Sumerian culture. Yet, perhaps, the most remarkable achievement of Zukukip's reign was the establishment of the first diplomatic protocols. The king understood that true power came not from the ability to destroy enemies, but from the capacity to transform them into allies. His ambassadors were chosen not for their skill with weapons, but for their wisdom in speech, their understanding of human nature, and their ability to find common ground even in the most unlikely circumstances. The palace archives from this period, written on clay tablets that would survive the rise and fall of empires, record negotiations that read like poetry, agreements that were sealed not just with wax and signet rings, but with mutual respect and the recognition that all peoples shared the same fundamental desires for peace, prosperity, and the blessing of their gods. As the years passed and the dynasty of Kish grew in strength and wisdom, the city became more than just a center of power. It became a symbol of what human civilization could achieve when guided by divine wisdom and tempered by humility. The ziggurat at the city's heart rose tier by tier, each level a prayer in stone, each brick a testament to the belief that mortal effort, when blessed by the gods, could reach toward heaven itself. Fourth king, Kula, ruled for 900 years, and was remembered not for conquest, but for creation under his reign. The first comprehensive code of laws was developed, a system of justice that recognized that different crimes required different punishments, that mercy was as important as severity, and that the law must serve not just the powerful but the powerless as well. The Code of Kula, as it came to be known, was revolutionary in its recognition that justice was not the prerogative of the strong but the birthright of all citizens. It established courts where even the humblest farmer could seek redress against the mightiest noble, where evidence was weighed not by the status of the accuser but by the truth of the accusation, and where judges were chosen not for their wealth or connections but for their wisdom and integrity. The Palace of Kula became a place where petitioners from across the known world would come to seek justice, their cases heard in halls where the walls themselves seemed to whisper of fairness and the sacred responsibility of those who held power. Over the lives of others, the king would often preside over these proceedings himself, his presence a reminder that the law was not an abstract concept but a living force that required constant vigilance and eternal commitment. During this golden age of Kish, the arts flourished as never before. The first epic poems were composed, stories that captured not just the deeds of heroes but the struggles of ordinary people, the love of parents for children, the grief of widows, and the hope of farmers planting seeds in the spring. These tales, told in the common tongue but elevated by the skill of master storytellers, became the foundation of a literary tradition that would influence every culture that followed. The craftsmen of Kish developed techniques that would be passed down through generations, their workshops becoming centers of innovation where the practical needs of daily life were met with solutions that were both functional and beautiful. The pottery from this period, with its distinctive glazes and elegant forms, would be treasured by collectors for millennia, each piece a reminder of a time when utility and beauty were considered inseparable. Music, too, reached new heights during Kula's reign. The first orchestras were formed, groups of musicians who played instruments crafted with a precision that made each note a prayer and each melody a pathway to the divine. The palace concerts became legendary, events where the king himself would sometimes perform, his voice joining with those of his subjects in harmonies that seemed to bridge the gap between earth and heaven. The reign of Kula also saw the development of the first systematic approach to agriculture, with innovations that would transform not just the fields around Kish, but the entire concept of farming. The king's agricultural advisors developed new techniques for irrigation, crop rotation, and soil management that increased yields while preserving the long-term fertility of the land. These advances were not kept secret, but were shared freely with neighboring cities, a generosity that reflected the king's understanding that prosperity was not a zero-sum game, but a rising tide that could lift all boats. The agricultural colleges established during this period would become models for similar institutions across the ancient world, their graduates carrying the knowledge of Kish to distant lands where it would take root and flourish. As the dynasty of Kish reached its zenith, the city became a beacon of learning and culture that drew students and scholars from across the known world. The great library, built during Kula's reign, housed thousands of tablets containing the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. From practical manuals on metalworking to philosophical treatises on the nature of justice and the obligations of rulers, the librarians of Kish were more than mere keepers of books. They were guardians of human memory, scholars who understood that knowledge was useless unless it was shared, teachers who saw their role not just as preserving the past, but as preparing for the future. The library became a place where ideas cross-pollinated, where the wisdom of one generation was passed to the next, and where the boundaries between disciplines dissolved in the pursuit of understanding. Even as Kish reached these heights of achievement, the seeds of change were already being planted. In the distant city of Uruk, a new kind of kingship was emerging, one that would challenge the gentle wisdom of Kish with the fierce energy of youth, the patient cultivation of culture with the bold assertion of power, and the collaborative spirit of scholarship with the individual brilliance of heroes who would reshape the world through the force of their own extraordinary will. In the southern reaches of the land between the rivers, where the marshes met the sky and the water birds called to each other across the endless expanse of reeds, a different kind of city was taking shape. Uruk rose not from the careful planning of dynasty builders, but from the raw energy of a people who believed that greatness was not inherited, but seized, not granted by gods, but wrested from the very fabric of destiny itself. The first king of Uruk, whose name would echo through eternity, was Meskhyagsha, son of the sun god Utu, whose reign of 324 years marked the beginning of a new age in the land of Sumer. Unlike the gentle rulers of Kish, who governed through consensus and wisdom, Meskhyagsha understood that true power came from the ability to inspire, to lead not by committee but by example, and to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary through the sheer force of will. Palace of Meskhyagsha was built not as a fortress, but as a temple to human ambition, its walls rising from the earth like a mountain of stone and fired brick, each level a testament to the belief that mortal effort, when channeled through divine inspiration, could achieve anything. The king himself was said to be a man of tremendous physical strength and charisma, capable of lifting stones that would challenge 10 ordinary men, and of speaking with such eloquence that his words could move listeners to tears or laughter with equal ease under Meskhai-Agsha's rule. Uruk became a city of builders and dreamers, a place where the impossible was merely another word for the not yet accomplished. The first great walls were constructed during his reign, barriers that protected not just the city but the very concept of urban civilization from the chaos that still threatened to reclaim the world. These walls would become legendary. Their construction, a feat of engineering that required not just technical skill, but the ability to organize thousands of workers into a coordinated effort that lasted for decades. The king's greatest achievement, however, was not architectural, but spiritual. Meskhai-Agsha understood that a city was more than just buildings and walls. It was a community of souls, united by shared purpose and common destiny. He established the first festivals that brought together people from all walks of life, celebrations that honored not just the gods but the human spirit that allowed ordinary mortals to achieve extraordinary things. These festivals became the heart of Uruk's culture. Events where the barriers between noble and commoner, priest and farmer, artist and craftsman dissolved in the shared joy of celebration. The king would participate, not as a distant figure on a throne, but as a fellow celebrant. His presence a reminder that leadership was not about standing apart from the people, but about standing with them in their moments of triumph and joy. The legacy of Meskhai-Agsha lived on in his son Enmerkar, whose name would become synonymous with the very idea of heroic kingship where his father had built the foundations of Uruk's greatness. Enmerkar would construct the edifice of legend itself, his deeds so extraordinary that they would be remembered and retold for thousands of years. Enmerkar's reign began not with coronation but with challenge. The distant city of Uruk, wealthy and proud, had refused to acknowledge Uruk's growing power, and their king had sent messengers declaring that his city would never bow to the upstart rulers of the marshlands rather than respond with armies. Enmerkar chose a different path. He would win through wisdom, courage, and the kind of heroic persistence that would become the hallmark of the greatest Sumerian kings. The contest between Uruk and Aratta lasted for years. A battle fought not on bloody fields but in the realm of ideas, a war of wits and will that would establish the template for civilized conflict. Enmerkar sent his own messengers to Aratta, men chosen not for their skill with weapons, but for their ability to speak with eloquence and conviction, their words carrying the power to transform enemies into allies and obstacles into opportunities. The negotiations between the two cities became legendary, diplomatic exchanges that read like epic poetry, filled with metaphors drawn from the natural world and arguments that appealed not to fear but to the higher angels of human nature. Enmerkar's representatives spoke of trade rather than tribute, of mutual prosperity rather than domination, and of the benefits that would come to both cities if they could find common ground. Yet even as the diplomatic dance continued, Enmerkar was preparing for the possibility that words might not be enough. He understood that true strength came not from the ability to make war, but from the capacity to make peace, from a position of unassailable power under his direction. The military forces of Uruk were reorganized and retrained, transformed from a collection of individual warriors into a coordinated army that could move and fight as a single organism. The weapons of Uruk were not just tools of war, but works of art, each blade forged by master craftsmen who understood that beauty and function were not opposites, but complementary aspects of perfection. The shields bore designs that told stories of heroic deeds, the spears were balanced with mathematical precision, and the armor was crafted to protect not just the body but the soul, of the warrior who wore it when the final confrontation came. It took the form not of a battle but of a contest of champions, a single combat that would determine the fate of both cities without the need for armies to clash and thousands to die. Enma-Ka himself stepped forward to represent Uruk, his presence on the field of honor, a declaration that a true king led not from behind but from the front. That leadership meant being willing to risk everything for the sake of one's people. The combat was fierce but brief, a display of skill and courage that left no doubt about the outcome. The champion of Aratta, a mighty warrior known throughout the land for his strength and ferocity, found himself facing not just a skilled opponent, but a force of nature, a man who fought with the precision of a craftsman and the passion of a poet. When the dust settled, Enma-Ka stood victorious, his triumph complete not just in the physical realm, but in the realm of the spirit. The aftermath of this victory revealed the true greatness of Enma-Ka's character. Rather than demand tribute or submission, he offered the defeated city a partnership, a relationship based on mutual respect and shared prosperity. The wealth of Aratta would flow to Uruk, but in return, the craftsmanship and artistic traditions of Uruk would enrich the culture of Aratta, creating a synthesis that would benefit both peoples for generations to come. This magnanimity in victory became the foundation of Enma-Ka's lasting reputation. He understood that true conquest was not about destroying enemies, but about transforming them into allies. Not about taking wealth, but about creating it. And not about ruling through fear, but about leading through inspiration. The treaties he negotiated during this period would serve as models for diplomatic agreements for centuries to come. The reign of Enma-Ka also saw the flowering of the arts in Uruk, a cultural renaissance that would establish the city as a center of learning and creativity. The king himself was said to be a poet of considerable skill, his verses capturing not just the deeds of heroes but the quiet moments of beauty that made life worth living. The flight of birds over the marshes, the sound of children playing in the streets, the gentle laughter of lovers meeting in the evening shadows. The schools of Uruk became renowned throughout the ancient world, centers of learning where students came not just to master practical skills, but to explore the deepest questions of existence. The curriculum included not just writing and mathematics, but philosophy, astronomy, and the arts of leadership, creating a generation of graduates who would carry the influence of Uruk's culture to distant lands. The architectural achievements of Enma-Ka's reign were equally impressive. The great temple complex at the heart of Uruk was expanded and beautified, its walls decorated with the work of master artists whose skill in working stone and metal would not be equaled for centuries. The palace itself became a wonder of the ancient world, its gardens filled with plants from every corner of the known world, its halls echoing with the music of the greatest performers of the Ajet. Perhaps the most lasting achievement of Enma-Ka's reign was the establishment of the first systematic approach to governance that recognized the individual worth of every citizen. The king created institutions that allowed even the humblest farmer to petition for justice, established schools that offered education to children regardless of their social status, and implemented economic policies that created opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth. This revolutionary approach to leadership would influence every subsequent ruler in Mesopotamia, establishing principles that would eventually spread throughout the ancient world. The idea that a king's legitimacy came not from divine right alone, but from the consent and welfare of his people would become one of the foundational concepts of civilized government. As Enma-Ka's long reign drew to a close, the king began to prepare for the succession. understanding that his greatest legacy would not be his own achievements, but the foundation he had laid for those who would follow. He chose his heir not from among his own sons, but from among the most capable leaders of the realm, establishing a precedent that would ensure the continuity of effective leadership even when the accidents of birth might otherwise have produced incompetent rulers. The chosen successor was Lugalbanda, a man whose name would become synonymous with the very concept of heroic leadership, where Enmarkar had been a king of vision and wisdom. Lugalbanda would be a king of action and adventure. His deeds, so extraordinary that they would inspire legends that would be told around campfires for thousands of years. The transition of power from Enmarkar to Lugalbanda was accomplished not through violence or intrigue, but through a carefully orchestrated process that demonstrated the maturity of Uruk's political institutions. The outgoing king served as mentor to his successor, sharing not just the practical knowledge of governance, but the deeper wisdom that came from decades of experience in dealing with the complexities of human nature and the challenges of leadership. This peaceful transfer of power would become one of the defining characteristics of Uruk's golden age, a demonstration that civilization had advanced to the point where the succession of rulers could be accomplished through law and custom rather than through the brutal conflicts that had characterized earlier periods. The stability this provided would allow the city to flourish in ways that would have been impossible under the constant threat of civil war and to succession. Krasizaz Lugalbanda took the throne of Uruk. He inherited not just a kingdom, but a legacy of greatness that would challenge him to achieve even greater heights. The city had become the jewel of the ancient world, its influence extending far beyond its walls, its culture serving as a model for civilizations that were just beginning to emerge from the darkness of prehistory. The new king understood that with great power came great responsibility, and that the true measure of his reign would not be his own glory, but the prosperity and happiness of his people. He would face challenges that would test not just his courage and wisdom, but his very soul. And in meeting those challenges, he would establish a reputation that would endure long after his mortal form had returned to the dust from which it came. The stage was set for the next great chapter in the story of Sumer, a tale that would feature not just the rise of individual heroes, but the emergence of a new kind of civilization, one that would serve as the foundation for all human progress that would follow in the palace of Uruk. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, a new king prepared to write his name in the annals of eternity, his deeds destined to echo through the corridors of time like the whisper of wind through the reeds of the eternal marshes. The reign of Lugalbanda would prove to be one of the most remarkable in the history of Sumer, a period when the boundaries between myth and reality would blur, when the actions of a mortal king would take on the dimensions of divine epic, and when the city of Uruk would reach heights of achievement that would not be surpassed for centuries to come. In the gathering darkness of the ancient world, a new star was rising, and its light would illuminate the path that all future civilizations would follow in their quest for greatness. Sacred fires burned bright in the temples of Uruk as the people celebrated the coronation of their new king, their voices rising in songs that seemed to bridge the gap between earth and heaven, their joy a testament to the belief that in the hands of a truly great leader, even the humblest clay could be transformed into something approaching divinity itself. Overflowed like tributaries merging into a mighty river, carrying with it the dreams and ambitions of mortal men who dared to claim dominion over the fertile plains between the rivers. The age of scattered city-states was drawing to its close, and in its place arose something unprecedented, the first true empires that would reshape the very meaning of kingship itself. In the shadow of towering ziggurats, A new breed of ruler emerged from the dust of countless battles. These were no longer the priest-kings of old, content to govern their sacred precincts and tend to their local gods. These were conquerors whose eyes turned beyond the familiar boundaries of their city walls, whose dreams stretched across the horizon like the wings of eagles seeking prey in distant lands. The transformation began subtly, like the first whispers of wind before a storm. Trade routes that had once connected the cities in peaceful commerce now became highways of conquest. The same rivers that had nourished the growth of civilization now carried the war boats of ambitious kings, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the Mesopotamian sun like deadly stars fallen to earth among the city-states. Lagash had grown mighty under the rule of a dynasty that understood the language of both diplomacy and warfare. Their king, Ine, stood as a figure who embodied this new age ruler who could speak eloquently in the temple courts, yet command with iron authority on the battlefield. His name would echo through the corridors of time, carved not merely in the soft clay of administrative records, but in the hard stone of victory monuments. The conflict that would define Inatum's reign and herald the age of conquest began with a dispute as old as civilization itself, the question of boundaries between Lagash and its neighbor Umma. Lay a strip of fertile land, blessed by the gods with rich soil and abundant water. Both cities claimed it by right of ancient treaty, by divine mandate, by the sweat of their farmers' brows. But in an age where might increasingly determined right, such disputes would no longer be settled in the halls of negotiation. Inatum's preparation for war was as methodical as it was ruthless. He understood that victory belonged not to the brave alone, but to the well-organized, the well-supplied, and the well-led. His armies were no longer mere collections of citizen soldiers, called from their fields and workshops. They were professional warriors, trained in the arts of siege and storm, disciplined in the movements of the phalanx, and loyal to their king above all earthly bonds. The weapons they carried spoke of technological advancement as much as military necessity. Bronze had replaced copper in their spears and axes, creating edges that could bite deep into enemy shields. An armor, the composite bow, reinforced with sinew and horn, could send arrows farther and with more force than the simple wooden bows of earlier generations' chariots. Those mobile platforms of death rolled across the battlefield like thunder made manifest, their bronze-shod wheels crushing opposition beneath their weight. When the armies of Lagash and Umma finally met in battle, it was not the chaotic melee of earlier conflicts, but a carefully orchestrated dance of destruction. Inatum had learned from the military innovations of his predecessors, adapting and improving upon tactics that had proven successful in smaller engagements. His soldiers moved with the precision of a well-tuned instrument, each unit playing its part in a symphony of conquests. The battle itself was swift and decisive. The forces of Umma, brave though they were, found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought by an enemy that had transformed warfare from a seasonal activity into a professional art. The field was left strewn with the dead and wounded, a grim testament to the new reality of political power in the land between the rivers. But Inatum's victory was more than a military triumph. It was a statement of political philosophy in the aftermath of battle. He erected a monument that would become known to history as the Stele of the Vultures. This massive stone relief, carved with scenes of victory and divine approval, depicted not merely the conquest of Umma, but the divine sanction of aggressive expansion, the gods themselves. The images proclaimed, favored the strong over the weak, the victorious over the vanquished. The stele showed Inatum leading his phalanx over the bodies of his enemies, while vultures feasted on the corpses of the defeated. It was a brutal image, but one that reflected the brutal realities of the new age. War was no longer an unfortunate necessity, but a means of advancement, a tool for building something greater than the sum of its parts. An empire, the success of Lagash under Inatum, inspired emulation and fear in equal measure among the other city-states. Kings who had been content to rule their ancestral domains now gazed with envious eyes at their neighbors' territories, the balance of power that it maintained. Relative peace for generations began to shift, as rulers realized that expansion was not merely an opportunity but a necessity for survival in Kish, the ancient city where kingship had first descended from heaven. A remarkable figure emerged to challenge the assumptions of male dominance in royal succession, Kababa, whose name would echo through the ages as the sole female ruler recorded in the Sumerian king list, rose to power through a combination of political acumen, economic savvy, and the favor of the gods. Her reign represented not merely an anomaly, but a testament to the fluid nature of power in an age of transformation. Q's rise to the throne was as unconventional as her gender. According to the chronicles, she had been a tavern keeper, a woman who understood the common people's needs and desires through her daily interactions with merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims. Her establishment had been a gathering place where news was shared, deals were struck, and the pulse of the city could be felt in its most natural state. From this humble beginning, she had gradually accumulated influence, becoming an unofficial mediator in disputes and a confidant to the powerful. Her ascension to formal power came during a period of political instability in Kish. The previous king had died without a clear heir, and the city faced the prospect of civil war between competing claimants. In this moment of crisis, Kababa's reputation for fairness and her understanding of the city's needs made her an attractive alternative to the warring factions. Her coronation was not merely a political expedient, but a recognition that leadership required more than noble birth or military prowess, demanded wisdom, compassion, and the ability to unite, rather than Devidekuboba's 100-year reign, as recorded in the king list, was characterized by internal development rather than external conquest. She understood that true strength came not from the size of one's army, but from the prosperity of one's people under her rule. Kish became a center of trade and learning, its markets bustling with merchants from distant lands, its temples renowned for their wisdom and their libraries filled with the accumulated knowledge of generations. Her approach to governance was revolutionary in its inclusivity, where male rulers had traditionally relied on councils of nobles and priests. Kababa consulted with merchants, artisans, and even farmers. She understood that the strength of a kingdom lay not in its ability to dominate others, but in its capacity to create prosperity for its own people. Her policies encouraged innovation, protected trade routes, and established systems of justice that were renowned for their fairness. Throughout the region, the contrast between Kababa's peaceful reign and the militaristic expansion of her contemporaries highlighted the different paths that lay before the Sumerian world. While other rulers pursued glory through conquest, she sought immortality through the prosperity and happiness of her subjects. Her success demonstrated that there were alternative models of kingship, ways of wielding power that did not require the constant clash of arms. Even as Kababa's reign provided a model of peaceful governance, the forces of change were gathering strength elsewhere in the Sumerian world. The very success of individual conquerors like Inatom had created a new dynamic, one in which expansion bred the need for further expansion. A victorious king could not simply return to his capital and resume the peaceful routines of administration. His soldiers expected rewards. His people expected the benefits of conquest, and his neighbors expected further aggression. This cycle of conquest and expansion reached its culmination in the rise of a figure whose name would become synonymous with empire itself, Sargon of Akkad. But Sargon's story was not merely one of military genius or political ambition. It was the story of a fundamental transformation in the nature of kingship. From the local ruler of a city-state to the supreme commander of a multi-ethnic empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, the northern reaches of the Sumerian world, where the great rivers began their journey toward the sea, there arose a city that would challenge the very foundations of Sumerian civilization, Uruk, whose precise location remains hidden beneath the sands of time, became the birthplace of an empire that would forever change the political landscape of the ancient world. From its royal palace emerged a king whose vision extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of city-state governance, whose ambitions encompassed not merely the domination of neighbors but the creation of a new form of political organization. Entirely Sargon of Akkad came to power during a period of political fragmentation, when the old certainties of Sumerian governance were crumbling under the weight of constant warfare and shifting alliances. The traditional system of independent city-states, each jealously guarding its sovereignty and its patron deity, had proven inadequate to the challenges of an increasingly complex world. Trade routes required protection across multiple jurisdictions. Agricultural systems demanded coordination beyond local boundaries, and the very success of individual cities created wealth that attracted raiders and conquerors from distant lands. Legends surrounding Sargon's birth and early life speak to the revolutionary nature of his rise, according to the tales passed down through generations of scribes. He was born in humble circumstances, abandoned as an infant to the mercy of the rivers, and raised by a gardener in the service of the king of Kish. His elevation from cupbearer to king was not merely a personal triumph, but a symbol of the social mobility that would characterize his empire. Unlike the traditional rulers who claimed divine descent and hereditary right, Sargon's authority rested on merit, achievement, and the favor of the gods, as demonstrated through success rather than proclaimed through birth. His conquest of Kish marked the beginning of a campaign that would reshape the political map of Mesopotamia. But this was not conquest in the traditional sense, with one city-state simply absorbing another. Sargon's vision was grander and more systematic. He sought to create a unified realm in which the individual city-states would maintain their local identities while acknowledging a supreme authority that transcended local loyalties and regional rivalries. The military innovations that made Sargon's conquests possible were as much organizational as technological. His armies represented a new model of warfare, one that combined the disciplined infantry techniques of the Sumerians with the mobility and striking power of forces drawn from the northern regions. His soldiers were professional warriors whose loyalty was to their king rather than to their city of origin. They were equipped with standardized weapons, trained in uniform tactics, and supported by a logistical system that could maintain them in the field for extended campaigns. The composite bow, which could penetrate armor at distances that rendered traditional defenses obsolete, became the signature weapon of Sargon's forces. His archers, many of them drawn from the semi-nomadic peoples of the northern steppes, could strike with devastating effect before enemy forces could close to spear range. This tactical advantage, combined with the mobility provided by horse-drawn chariots and the shock effect of massed infantry charges, made his armies nearly unstoppable in open battle. But Sargon's genius lay not merely in his ability to win battles, but in his understanding of how to consolidate victory. Previous conquerors had been content to extract tribute and recognition of supremacy from defeated cities, Sargon went further, establishing a system of imperial administration that could govern diverse populations across vast distances. His governors, drawn from both Akkadian and local elites, were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and ensuring that the empire's policies were implemented consistently across its territories. The conquest of Uruk, the ancient city of Gilgamesh, demonstrated both the scope of Sargon's ambitions and the sophistication of his methods. Uruk had been the premier city of the Sumerian world, its kings claiming supremacy over all other rulers, its temples serving as centers of learning and religious authority. Its defeat by Sargon was not merely a military victory, but a symbolic triumph that announced the arrival of a new age. The siege of Uruk revealed the evolution of military technology and tactics. Since the days of Anatum, Sargon's forces employed sophisticated siege techniques, including the use of mobile towers, battering rams, and mining operations that could breach even the strongest fortifications. The city's defenders, despite their courage and the strength of their walls, found themselves facing an enemy that had learned to overcome traditional defensive advantages through innovation and persistence. The fall of Uruk sent shockwaves throughout the Sumerian world. If the greatest of the city-states could not withstand Sargon's assault, what hope did the smaller cities have? One by one, the ancient centers of Sumerian civilization opened their gates to the Akkadian king. Sometimes after brief resistance, sometimes without a fight. Lagash, Eridu, the cities that had once competed for supremacy now acknowledged the authority of a single ruler. Yet Sargon's empire was more than a collection of conquered cities. It represented a new concept of political organization, one that would influence the development of governance for millennia to come. The emperor for Sargon was the first to claim that title was not merely the king of Akkad, who had conquered other cities. He was the supreme ruler of a unified realm, the earthly representative of divine authority, the guarantor of peace and order across the known world. The administrative system that Sargon established to govern his empire was revolutionary in its scope and sophistication. Written law, standardized weights and measures, and a common system of taxation created a framework within which diverse populations could coexist and prosper. The old system of city-states, with their competing laws and customs, gave way to an imperial structure that provided consistency and predictability across vast territories. Trade flourished under the imperial system as never before. Merchants could travel from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean without crossing hostile borders or navigating complex treaty arrangements. The standardization of currency and measures meant that business could be conducted efficiently across the empire. The protection provided by imperial forces made long-distance commerce safer and more profitable than ever before. The cultural implications of Sargon's empire were as profound as its political and economic effects. The interaction between Akkadian and Sumerian cultures created a new synthesis, one that preserved the best of both traditions while creating something entirely new. The Akkadian language, written in cuneiform script adapted from Sumerian, became the lingua franca of the empire. Akkadian myths and legends were blended with Sumerian religious traditions, creating a shared cultural heritage that transcended local boundaries. Yet, the very success of Sargon's empire created new challenges and contradictions. The maintenance of such a vast realm required constant vigilance, continuous military campaigns, and enormous resources. The emperor could not simply rule from his capital as the old city-state kings had done. He had to be constantly on the move, showing himself to his subjects, crushing rebellions, and defending against external threats. The burden of empire was as great as its rewards. The later years of Sargon's reign were marked by increasing challenges to his authority. The conquered cities, despite their submission, retained their local identities, and their desire for independence. Rebellions erupted periodically, requiring the emperor to deploy his forces to maintain order. The very size of the empire made it difficult to respond quickly to threats, and the cost of maintaining garrisons throughout the realm strained even the abundant resources of Mesopotamia. External threats also multiplied as the empire's success attracted the attention of peoples beyond its borders. The wealth of the Akkadian empire made it an attractive target for raiders and conquerors from the mountains and deserts that surrounded the fertile river valleys. The same roads that facilitated trade also provided avenues for invasion, and the same prosperity that supported the empire's armies also created wealth that others coveted. Despite these challenges, Sargon's achievement was undeniable. He had created something new under the sun, a political organization that transcended the limitations of the city-state system and pointed toward new possibilities for human governance. His empire would not survive him intact, but the precedent he had established would inspire conquerors and empire builders for generations too. Come the death of Sargon marked not the end of the imperial experiment, but the beginning of a new phase in its evolution. His sons, Ramush and Manishtushu, inherited not merely a throne but a responsibility to maintain and extend the revolutionary system their father had created. The challenge they faced was unprecedented in human history: how to preserve the unity of a vast empire while maintaining the legitimacy of their rule over populations that had never known a single master. The succession of Ramosh to the imperial throne revealed the fragility of the new political order. No sooner had news of Sargon's death reached the provinces than rebellions erupted throughout the empire. The conquered cities, which had chafed under Akkadian rule despite its benefits, saw in the transition of power an opportunity to reassert their independence. The assumption that imperial authority was somehow weaker without its founder proved to be a costly miscalculation. Response to these challenges demonstrated that he had inherited not merely his father's throne but his understanding of power. Rather than attempting to negotiate with the rebels or offer concessions that might have weakened the imperial structure, he chose to crush the uprisings with overwhelming force. His campaigns against the rebel cities were swift, brutal, and decisive, serving as a warning to others who might contemplate similar resistance. The reconquest of Uruk and Lagash during Ramush's reign illustrated the evolution of imperial military doctrine. The forces that Sargon had used to create the empire had been largely Akkadian, supplemented by auxiliaries from allied cities. Ramush's armies, by contrast, were truly imperial in their composition, drawing soldiers from throughout the realm and utilizing the diverse military traditions of the empire's various peoples. This integration of military forces served not merely a practical purpose but a symbolic one, demonstrating that the empire was more than an Akkadian conquest, but a unified realm with shared interests and common destiny. The brutality of Ramush's campaigns was not gratuitous but calculated. He understood that the empire's survival depended on the perception that rebellion was futile, and that the costs of resistance far outweighed any potential benefits. The destruction of rebel cities and the deportation of their populations served as object lessons to others who might contemplate similar defiance, yet this harsh policy was balanced by generous treatment of those who remained loyal, creating a system of incentives that encouraged submission while punishing resistance. The reign of Manishtushu, who succeeded his brother, saw the empire's expansion beyond the traditional boundaries of Mesopotamia. His campaigns in the Persian Gulf and his establishment of trading posts along the Arabian coast demonstrated that the imperial vision had grown beyond the conquest of city-states to encompass the control of entire regions. The empire was becoming not merely a political entity, but an economic system that could coordinate production and trade across vast distances. The administrative innovations of this period reflected the growing sophistication of imperial governance, the development of a professional bureaucracy, staffed by scribes trained in the imperial capital, ensured that policies could be implemented consistently throughout the realm. The establishment of regular communication systems, utilizing relay stations and standardized procedures, made it possible for the emperor to maintain direct control over distant provinces. The creation of a common legal code based on Akkadian precedents but incorporating local customs provided a framework for justice that was both universal and flexibly. At the very success of the imperial system created new forms of instability, the concentration of power in the hands of a single ruler. While effective for military campaigns and administrative coordination, created a dangerous dependence on the personality and capabilities of the emperor. The empire's subjects, accustomed to local autonomy and traditional forms of governance, found it difficult to understand or accept the abstract concept of imperial authority. The legitimacy of the empire rested not on ancient custom or divine mandate, but on the demonstrated ability of its rulers to provide security and prosperity. The reign of Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon, represented both the apex of the Akkadian Empire and the beginning of its decline. His assumption of divine status, symbolized by his adoption of the horned crown traditionally reserved for gods, reflected the evolution of imperial ideology. The emperor was no longer merely the supreme earthly ruler, but the earthly manifestation of divine authority, the guarantor of cosmic order, the bridge between heaven and earth. This deification of the emperor served important political functions. It provided a theological foundation for imperial unity, giving subjects throughout the realm a common focus for their loyalty. It elevated the emperor above local rulers and traditional authorities, making rebellion not merely an act of political defiance, but a form of religious sacrilege. It also provided a model for understanding imperial authority that could be adapted to different local traditions and beliefs. Naram-Sin's military campaigns extended the empire's boundaries further than ever before. His conquest of the Lullaby in the Zagros Mountains and his campaigns in Syria and Anatolia demonstrated that the empire had become a truly international power, capable of projecting its authority across the known world. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, depicting the emperor climbing a mountain and receiving the submission of his enemies, became an iconic representation of imperial power and divine sanction. The artistic and cultural achievements of Naram-Sin's reign reflected the empire's growing confidence and sophistication. The fusion of Akkadian and Sumerian traditions had created a new imperial culture that was both cosmopolitan and distinctive. The development of new literary forms, the creation of monumental architecture, and the establishment of artistic conventions that would influence Mesopotamian culture for centuries demonstrated that the empire was not merely a military and administrative achievement, but a cultural one as well. Yet, the very grandeur of Naram-Sin's reign concealed growing structural problems within the empire. The cost of maintaining such a vast realm was enormous, requiring constant taxation and military service from populations that received little direct benefit from imperial expansion. The complexity of administering diverse territories with different languages, customs, and traditions strained even the sophisticated bureaucratic systems that had been developed. The emperor's assumption of divine status, while providing ideological unity, also created expectations that no mortal ruler could fulfill. The first serious challenges to Naram-Sin's authority came not from within the empire, but from beyond its borders. The Gushans, a people from the Zagros Mountains, began a series of raids that gradually escalated into a full-scale invasion. These mountain warriors, skilled in guerrilla warfare and motivated by the prospect of sharing in the empire's wealth, proved to be a formidable enemy. Their decentralized organization made them difficult to defeat decisively, while their knowledge of the terrain gave them significant advantages in their home territory. The Gushan invasions exposed the fundamental vulnerability of the Akkadian Empire. Its strength lay in its ability to coordinate large-scale military operations and maintain control over settled populations against enemies who could strike quickly and disappear into inaccessible terrain. The traditional imperial advantages became liabilities. The very roads and communication systems that facilitated imperial administration also provided avenues for enemy penetration into the heart of the empire. The response to the Gushan threat revealed both the resilience and the limitations of the imperial system. Naram-Sin's forces, despite their professional training and superior equipment, found it difficult to bring the invaders to decisive battle. The emperor's attempts to secure the empire's borders through the construction of fortifications and the establishment of military colonies proved inadequate to the scale of the threat. The empire's subjects, particularly in the peripheral regions, began to question whether imperial authority could provide the security and prosperity it had promised. The final years of Naram-Sin's reign were marked by increasing internal dissent and external pressure. The empire's resources were stretched to the breaking point by the demands of defending such vast territories against multiple threats. The administrative system that had once been the empire's greatest strength began to show signs of strain, as communication became difficult and provincial governors found themselves increasingly isolated from central authority. The death of Naram-Sin marked the end of the Akkadian Empire's golden age. His successor, Shar-Kali-Shari, inherited a realm that was already showing signs of fragmentation. The great experiment in imperial governance that had begun with Sargon's conquests was entering its final phase. But the precedent it had established would endure. The concept of empire, of a single authority ruling over diverse peoples and territories, had become a permanent part of the political imagination of the ancient world. The legacy of the Akkadian Empire extended far beyond its political achievements. It had demonstrated that large-scale political organization was possible, that diverse populations could be unified under a single authority, and that the benefits of such unity could outweigh the costs of its maintenance. The administrative techniques, military innovations, and cultural syntheses that had been developed during the imperial period would influence the development of later empires throughout the ancient world. Yet the empire's collapse also provided important lessons about the limitations of imperial power. The concentration of authority in the hands of a single ruler, while effective for certain purposes, created dangerous vulnerabilities. The attempt to impose uniformity on diverse populations generated resistance that could destabilize the entire system. The costs of maintaining such a vast realm could exceed even the abundant resources of Mesopotamia, leading to economic strain and social unrest. The Akkadian Empire entered its final phase. The stage was set for a new chapter in the story of Mesopotamian kingship. The city-states that had once competed for supremacy would have an opportunity to reassert their independence, but they would do so in a world that had been forever changed by the imperial experience. The memory of unity, of a single authority ruling over the entire known world, would continue to inspire and challenge future rulers. The age of empire had begun. And though individual empires might rise and fall, the idea of imperial unity would endure as a constant presence in the political life of the ancient world. The winds of change were stirring once again across the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, carrying with them the dust of fallen empires and the seeds of new dynasties in the south, where the first cities had risen from the marshes and the first kings had claimed divine sanction. A new power was preparing to emerge, the Sumerian people who had given the world its first written laws and its first great literature, were about to experience one final renaissance that would restore their ancient glory while adapting to the realities of the new imperial age. The great cities of Mesopotamia lay beneath a shroud of silence, their once mighty walls crumbling like sand before the wind. The Gushans, those mountain warriors who had swept down from the Zagros heights, ruled now with a heavy hand over the scattered remnants of empire. Their names, when recorded at all, were harsh syllables that carried no poetry, no connection to the ancient songs that once echoed through ziggurat chambers in this time of shadow. The very concept of kingship seemed to wither. The Gushans appointed their own rulers, men whose authority rested not on divine mandate or the blessing of sacred waters, but on the strength of their swords and the fear they could inspire. The cuneiform tablets speak of this period in hushed tones, describing rulers whose reigns were measured not in the patient cycles of seasons, but in the swift passage of violence. And Apevelara Dupuri ruled for 2 years before falling to a rival's blade. Imta held power for 3 years, only to vanish into the same darkness that had claimed his predecessors. Inkashush managed 7 years, a lifetime in those uncertain times before he too was swept away by the tide of chaos that seemed to consume all who dared claim dominion over the ancient land. The great libraries of Akkad were scattered, their precious tablets broken or carried away as curiosities by warriors who could not read the wisdom they contained. The irrigation channels, those arteries of civilization that had sustained millions, fell into disrepair without the coordinated effort that only stable kingship could provide. Fields that had flourished under the careful administration of Sargon's bureaucrats now lay fallow, their fertility returning to the wild grasses that had covered the land before the first cities rose. Yet, even in this darkness, the memory of greatness endured in the southern marshes, where the Euphrates split into countless channels before meeting the sea. The old ways persisted here. In cities like Uruk and Uruk, the temple priests maintained their vigils, preserving the sacred rites that had been practiced since the dawn of time. The god Marduk still received his offerings, though they came now from humble fishermen rather than mighty kings. The goddess Inanna still walked in the hearts of her people, though her festivals were celebrated in whispers rather than with the great processions of old. The Sumerian king list, compiled in later times, records the Gushan period with a mixture of disdain and sorrow. Who was king? Who was not king? The scribes asked, their stylus heavy with the weight of lost generations. The traditional formulae of royal succession, so carefully maintained through centuries of rule, broke down in the face of this foreign domination. Instead of the flowing narrative of divine appointment and heroic deeds, the list becomes a stark catalogue of names and brief reigns, each entry a reminder of instability and decline. Lagab ruled for 6 years. Shulma held power for 6 years. Ilomish managed 5 years before his reign ended. In violence, Inimbakish, Igushosh, Yalagab, Iarla Kurum, Apilkin, Lairabum, Irarum, Ibranum, Hablum, Puzursin, Yarlaganda, Siu, Tyriga. Their names march across the historical record like ghosts, each representing a brief moment of attempted order in a world that had forgotten how to sustain the ancient harmonies of kingship. The physical evidence of this dark age speaks eloquently of collapse. Archaeological excavations reveal thin layers of ash and debris where once great palaces stood. The fine pottery of the Akkadian period gives way to crude vessels, hastily made and poorly fired. The sophisticated bronze work that had marked the pinnacle of Mesopotamian craftsmanship disappears, replaced by simple iron implements that speak of necessity rather than artistry. Trade, that lifeline of civilization, dwindled to a trickle. The great caravan routes that had carried goods from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean became dangerous paths, traveled only by the most desperate merchants. The standardized weights and measures that had facilitated commerce throughout the Akkadian Empire fell into disuse, each city reverting to its own local systems. The very concept of a unified economic sphere, that great achievement of Sargon's vision, crumbled like clay in the rain. The temples, the priests maintained their rituals with increasing desperation. The gods seemed distant, their voices silent in the face of such widespread suffering. The careful astronomical observations that had guided agricultural planning for generations became irregular, their significance lost as the knowledge passed from master to student grew fragmented. The great festivals that had marked the turning of the seasons continued, but they were hollow echoes of their former glory, lacking the resources and royal patronage that had once made them spectacular celebrations of divine and earthly power. Yet it was in these very temples that the seeds of renewal were quietly germinating. The priests, those guardians of ancient wisdom, never ceased their work entirely. They copied and recopied the old texts, preserving the laws and literature that would prove crucial to the coming Renaissance. They maintained the genealogies of the old royal houses, keeping alive the memory of legitimate rule in anticipation of the day when the proper order might be restored. The Gushan kings, perhaps 21 in total according to the traditional count, ruled for a period that the ancient sources describe as lasting 91 years and 40 days. This precise reckoning, preserved in the careful mathematics of the scribal schools, speaks to the enduring Mesopotamian obsession with time and its measurement. Even in the darkest hours, the priests continued their observations of the heavens, tracking the movements of stars and planets that remained constant while earthly kingdoms rose and fell. As the Gushan period drew toward its close, signs of renewal began to appear in the city of Uruk. A prince named Utuhigel began to gather followers, speaking of liberation and the restoration of Sumerian rule. His name, meaning the sun is abundant, seemed to promise an end to the long night that had settled over the land. The gods, it was whispered, were finally ready to remember their chosen people and restore the proper order of things. The rebellion that followed was swift and decisive. Utuhigel, drawing upon the accumulated resentment of generations of foreign rule, rallied the southern cities to his cause. The Gutians, weakened by their own internal divisions and isolated from their mountain homeland, found themselves facing a coordinated uprising led by men who understood the land and its people in ways they never could. The final battle came at the city of Awen, where the last Gushan king, Sargon, made his stand. The ancient texts describe the conflict in terms that echo the great myths of creation, with Utuhigel cast as a divine champion bringing order from chaos when the dust settled and the enemy was defeated. The way was clear for the restoration of native rule and the beginning of what would become known as the Sumerian Renaissance. But Utuhigel's triumph was destined to be brief. Like so many liberators before and after him, he found that winning freedom was easier than maintaining it. His reign lasted only 7 years, a time of transition during which the old administrative systems were gradually restored and the work of rebuilding began. Yet even as he labored to undo the damage of the Gushan period, forces were gathering in the south that would soon eclipse his own achievement, the ancient city of Ur, where the moon god Nana had been worshipped since the dawn of time. A new royal house was rising, the man who had found the third dynasty of Ur and usher in the greatest flowering of Sumerian civilization, was already making his presence felt, gathering the skilled administrators and military leaders who would help him create an empire that would surpass even the achievements of Sargon. The great city of Ur stood like a jewel beside the life-giving waters of the Euphrates, its great ziggurat rising toward the heavens in stepped terraces that seemed to bridge the gap between earth and sky. This was the city where the moon god Nena held court, where the sacred marriage of heaven and earth was celebrated each year in rituals that had endured since the beginning of time. And it was here that destiny chose to place the man who would restore Sumerian greatness to its fullest flowering. Anamu came to power in the shadow of Utuhigel's brief reign. But his rise was no mere accident of succession. The sources speak of him as a military leader of extraordinary skill, one who understood that true kingship required more than the ability to win battles. He possessed that rare combination of warrior spirit and administrative genius that marks the greatest rulers of history. His name, meaning the god Nana, is brilliant, seemed to prophesy the illumination he would bring to a land that had endured too long in darkness. The circumstances of his rise remain shrouded in the diplomatic language of ancient chronicles, but the outlines are clear enough. Yornamu had served as governor of Ur under Utuhegel, but when the liberator king died, the succession was disputed rather than allow the fragile unity of the Sumerian cities to fracture once again. Ur acted with the decisive boldness that would characterize his entire reign. He consolidated his power base in the south, gathered the loyalty of the temple hierarchies, and presented himself to the assembled nobles as the legitimate heir to the throne of Sumer. And Akkadian coronation ceremony that followed was a masterpiece of political theater, designed to erase the memory of foreign rule and re-establish the divine foundations of Mesopotamian kingship. Uranamu appeared before the people dressed in the ancient regalia of the Sumerian kings, his crown bearing the horns of divinity that marked him as the earthly representative of the gods. The priests of Nana performed the sacred rituals of investiture, while representatives from every major city came forward to pledge their allegiance to the new sovereign. But ceremony alone could not restore the shattered unity of the old empire. Yornamu faced the enormous task of rebuilding institutions that had been weakened by generations of neglect and foreign interference. The irrigation systems that formed the backbone of Mesopotamian agriculture required immediate attention, their channels clogged with silt and their distribution networks disrupted by years of warfare. The legal codes that had governed civil society had been corrupted by foreign influences, creating confusion and injustice that threatened the very foundations of social order. Most challenging of all was the need to restore the delicate balance between central authority and local autonomy that had characterized the golden age of Sumerian civilization. The city-states that made up the empire had ancient traditions of self-governance, jealously guarded privileges that no king could ignore without risking rebellion, yet without some form of unified control, the land would inevitably fragment into warring principalities, easy prey for the next wave of foreign invaders. And Amu's solution was elegant in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Rather than attempting to rule through the crude mechanisms of force that had characterized the Guatian period, he established a system of provincial governors who were directly responsible to the crown, but who governed according to local customs and traditions. These governors, known as Ensi, were carefully chosen for their loyalty to the dynasty and their understanding of regional needs. They served as the king's eyes and ears in the provinces, while ensuring that royal policy was implemented with sensitivity to local conditions. Military reforms that accompanied this administrative reorganization were equally sophisticated. Uruk created a professional army that combined the tactical flexibility of the old Sumerian city militias with the discipline and organization that had made the Akkadian forces so formidable. The new military system was based on a careful balance of infantry, cavalry, and siege specialists, each component trained to operate in coordination with the others. This was no mere collection of warriors, but a true war machine capable of projecting power across the breadth of the empire. Perhaps most importantly, Uruk understood that military and political power, without moral authority, was merely another form of tyranny. He set about creating a legal framework that would establish his dynasty as the guardian of justice and the protector of the weak. The Code of Uruk, carved in stone and promulgated throughout the empire, represents the earliest known attempt to create a comprehensive system of written law that would apply equally to all citizens, regardless of their social station. The code itself reveals the sophistication of Uruk's vision. Unlike the harsh, retributive justice that characterized many ancient legal systems, the Sumerian code emphasized compensation and rehabilitation over punishment. A man who stole another's property was required to restore it tenfold, but he was not mutilated or executed. A woman who committed adultery faced social sanctions, but she retained her basic rights, and her children were not penalized for her actions. The code recognized different classes of citizens and adjusted penalties accordingly, but it also established clear protections for slaves and foreigners who might otherwise have been at the mercy of local prejudices. The economic policies of the new regime were equally thoughtful. Uruk recognized that the prosperity of the empire depended on the free flow of goods and services across internal boundaries. He standardized weights and measures throughout his domains, established a unified currency system based on silver ingots of specified purity, and created a network of royal roads that facilitated both trade and communication. The great markets of Uruk and Babylon once again hummed with the activity of merchants from distant lands, their caravans protected by royal patrols and their disputes settled in courts that operated according to universally recognized principles. But perhaps Uruk's greatest achievement was his recognition that true kingship must be grounded in the sacred traditions that gave meaning to Sumerian life. He embarked on an ambitious program of temple reconstruction, rebuilding the great ziggurats that had fallen into disrepair during the Gushan period. The ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was completely rebuilt according to the ancient specifications preserved in the temple archives. This massive structure, rising in 3 great terraces to a height of over 70 feet, became the symbol of the dynasty's commitment to the gods and the visible proof of their divine favor. The temple rebuilding program was not merely a matter of religious observance. It was a sophisticated exercise in political economy. The great construction projects provided employment for thousands of workers, from skilled stonemasons and bronze workers to common laborers who carried mud, bricks, and hauled stone blocks. The temples themselves became centers of economic activity, their priests managing vast estates and their workshops producing the fine goods that were traded throughout the known world. The annual festivals that celebrated the gods became occasions for displaying the wealth and power of the dynasty, attracting visitors from across the empire and beyond. The cultural renaissance that accompanied these material achievements was equally remarkable. The scribal schools, those guardians of Sumerian learning, were revived and expanded under royal patronage. New copies of the ancient epics were prepared, their texts carefully edited and standardized for use throughout the empire. The story of Gilgamesh, that great hero king of Uruk, was given its canonical form during this period. Its themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning, resonating with audiences who had lived through the chaos of the Gushan period. The visual arts flourished as well, with sculptors and painters creating works that combined the traditional themes of Sumerian culture with new techniques and materials. The famous standard of Yor, with its intricate scenes of war and peace rendered in lapis lazuli and shell, epitomizes the artistic achievement of this period. The standard's war panel shows the king leading his army into battle, while the peace panel depicts the prosperity and abundance that flow from righteous rule together. These images capture the essential duality of Mesopotamian kingship, the warrior's strength and the shepherd's. Karanamu's reign of 18 years was marked by remarkable stability and growth, but it was also shadowed by the constant awareness that all earthly glory is temporary. The king who had restored Sumerian greatness died in battle, fighting against the Gushans who still held portions of the eastern provinces. His death was mourned throughout the empire, but the institutions he had created proved strong enough to survive the transition to his successor. The third dynasty of Yor would continue for another century, but it was Yor-Namu who had laid the foundations for what would be remembered as the final golden age of Sumerian civilization. In the royal workshops of Yor, master craftsmen worked by the light of oil lamps to create monuments that would outlast the very kingdom they served. The most precious of these was not made of gold or lapis lazuli, but of humble clay and stone, the great law stele that would carry Yor-Namu's name into eternity. This towering monument, carved with the wedge-shaped symbols of cuneiform script, represented something revolutionary in the history of human governance. The idea that justice could be systematized, that the arbitrary rule of kings could be replaced by the consistent application of written law. The prologue to the code reveals the philosophical depth of Yor-Namu's vision. Unlike the harsh justice of earlier periods, where punishment was swift and often brutal, the Sumerian approach emphasized restoration and social harmony. When An and Enlil had turned over the kingship of Yor to Nana, the inscription begins, "At that time I, Yor-Namu, man of Yor, was named the beloved husband of Inanna, established in the kingship over Sumer and Akkad." This was not merely a political appointment, but a sacred marriage between the king and the goddess of love and war, a union that sanctified the entire legal system. The code itself was comprehensive in scope, addressing everything from property rights and family relationships to commercial disputes and criminal behavior. What made it remarkable was not just its breadth, but its underlying philosophy of proportional justice. Where earlier legal systems had relied on the principle of retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, Yor-Namu's code introduced the concept of monetary compensation for most offenses. A man who cut off another's foot was required to pay 10 shekels of silver. A man who severed another's bone paid 1 mina. This system recognized that true justice lay not in multiplying suffering, but in restoring the balance that crime had disrupted. The provisions relating to family life revealed the sophisticated understanding of social relationships that characterized Sumerian civilization. Marriage was treated as a contractual arrangement, with clearly defined rights and obligations for both parties. A man who divorced his wife was required to provide her with financial support, while a woman who abandoned her husband faced social sanctions but retained her personal property. Children were protected from the arbitrary authority of their parents. with specific penalties for those who sold their offspring into slavery or failed to provide adequate care. The commercial provisions of the code were equally advanced, establishing standardized practices for contracts, loans, and trade relationships. The complex system of weights and measures that governed Mesopotamian commerce was given legal sanction, with severe penalties for merchants who used false scales or adulterated goods. The code recognized different categories of workers and established minimum standards for their treatment, protecting both free laborers and slaves from the worst forms of exploitation. Perhaps most remarkably, the code included provisions for what we might today call social welfare. Widows and orphans were granted special protection under the law, with the state assuming responsibility for their care when family support was unavailable. The blind, the lame, and other disabled individuals were recognized as entitled to community assistance. Their disabilities seen not as divine punishment, but as conditions that required collective response. This represented a remarkable evolution in human thinking about social responsibility and the obligations of government. The administration of justice under Uruk-Namu's system was as sophisticated as the laws themselves. The king established a hierarchy of courts, from local tribunals that handled minor disputes to royal courts that dealt with the most serious crimes. Judges were required to be literate, trained in the law, and certified by the central administration. They were paid regular salaries to reduce the temptation of corruption, and their decisions were subject to review by higher authorities. This represented one of the earliest attempts to create an independent judiciary, insulated from the immediate pressures of political power. The legal reforms were accompanied by equally significant changes in the military sphere. Uruk-Namu transformed the Sumerian army from a collection of city militias into a professional force capable of projecting power across the entire region. The new military system was based on a careful combination of infantry, cavalry, and siege specialists, each component trained to operate in coordination with the others. The famous Sumerian battle wagon, a heavy chariot pulled by onagers and manned by spearmen, became the symbol of this military revolution. The king's personal involvement in military affairs was both practical and symbolic. Uruk-Namu led his armies in the field, sharing the dangers and hardships of campaign with his soldiers. This was not mere ceremonial leadership, but active command of complex military operations. The king's presence on the battlefield served to legitimize the war effort and inspire the troops, while his tactical skill ensured that Sumerian forces could compete effectively with their enemies. The economic foundations of the new regime were equally carefully constructed. Uruk-Namu recognized that lasting prosperity required more than military conquest. It demanded the creation of conditions that would encourage trade, agriculture, and industry. He established a standardized currency system based on silver ingots of specified weight and purity, making it easier for merchants to conduct business. Across the empire, the great irrigation projects that had been neglected during the Gushan period were restored and expanded, bringing thousands of acres of marginal land into productive use. Temple complexes that dotted the landscape were not merely religious centers, but economic engines that drove the prosperity of the entire kingdom. Each temple controlled vast estates worked by dependent laborers, operated workshops that produced textiles and metal goods, and maintained flocks and herds that provided meat and dairy products for the urban populations. The priests who managed these enterprises were skilled administrators who understood the principles of accounting and inventory control that made large-scale economic activity possible. The cultural achievements of Uruk-Namu's reign were perhaps Even more significant than his political and military successes, the king was a patron of learning and the arts, supporting the scribal schools that preserved and transmitted Sumerian culture under his patronage. The great literary works of the past were collected, edited, and standardized, ensuring that future generations would have access to the wisdom of their ancestors. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Descent of Inanna, and countless other works received their canonical forms during this period. The architectural projects undertaken during Yornamu's reign were monuments to both divine piety and royal power. The great ziggurat of Yor, dedicated to the moon god Nanna, was completely rebuilt according to the ancient specifications preserved in the temple archives. This massive structure, rising in 3 great terraces to a height of over 70 feet, became the symbol of the dynasty's commitment to the gods and the visible proof of their divine favor. Similar projects were undertaken in other cities, creating a network of sacred architecture that unified the empire both spiritually and politically. The artistic production of the period reflected the sophisticated tastes of a court that saw itself as the heir to centuries of cultural achievement. Sculptors created works that combined traditional Sumerian themes with new techniques and materials, while painters and jewelers produced objects of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship. The famous golden helmet of Mesgalamdeg, discovered in the royal cemetery of Yor, exemplifies the artistic achievement of this period. Its intricate repousse work, demonstrating the skill of metalworkers who had mastered techniques that would not be equaled for centuries yet. For all his achievements, Yornamu remained aware of the fragility of human accomplishment. The king, who had restored the glory of Sumer, knew that his own reign was but a moment in the vast sweep of time, and he worked constantly to ensure that his successors would inherit a kingdom capable of meeting the challenges that lay ahead. The institutions he created, the laws he promulgated, and the culture he fostered would prove more durable than any of his military conquests, providing the foundation for what would be remembered as the final flowering of Sumerian civilization. The crown of Yor passed to Shulgi in the 18th year of his father's reign, when Yornamu fell in battle against the persistent Gutian forces that still threatened the eastern borders. The young king who accepted the horned crown of divinity was in many ways the opposite of his warrior father. Where Yornamu had been the conquering hero who restored Sumerian independence, Shulgi would prove to be the philosopher king who perfected the art of governance. His reign of 48 years would be remembered as the golden age of the 3rd dynasty of Yor, a time when the ancient dreams of Sumerian civilization reached their fullest expression. Shulgi's approach to kingship was revolutionary in its sophistication. Unlike the military leaders who had preceded him, he understood that true power lay not in the ability to wage war, but in the capacity to organize peace. His court became a center of learning where scholars from across the known world gathered to discuss philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and literature. The king himself was not merely a patron of learning, but an active participant in intellectual life, composing hymns and legal commentaries that revealed a mind of extraordinary depth and subtlety. The administrative system that Shulgi created was perhaps the most sophisticated form of government that the ancient world had yet seen. Every aspect of imperial administration was carefully systematized, from the collection of taxes and the maintenance of public works to the training of scribes and the conduct of diplomatic relations. The king established a professional civil service whose members were selected on the basis of merit rather than birth, creating a class of skilled administrators who could implement royal policy with consistency and efficiency across the vast territories of the Empire Central. To this administrative revolution was the development of a standardized system of record-keeping that allowed the government to track and manage resources with unprecedented precision. The cuneiform tablets that survive from Shulgi's reign reveal a bureaucracy of remarkable sophistication, capable of monitoring everything from the harvest yields of individual fields to the inventory of specific temple workshops. This information was not merely collected, but actively used to guide policy decisions, allowing the government to respond quickly to changing conditions and emerging problems. The legal system that Shulgi inherited from his father was expanded and refined into a comprehensive code that governed every aspect of civil and criminal law. The king's own legal commentaries, written in a style that combined practical wisdom with philosophical reflection, reveal a deep understanding of the principles that must guide a just society. Justice, in Shulgi's view, was not merely the mechanical application of rules, but a dynamic process that required constant attention to the changing needs of society and the evolving understanding of human nature. The economic policies of Shulgi's reign created a level of prosperity that had not been seen since the days of Sargon the Great. The king understood that wealth was not a finite resource to be hoarded, but a dynamic force that grew through circulation and investment. He established a sophisticated system of public works that provided employment for thousands of workers while creating the infrastructure necessary for long-term economic growth. The great roads that connected the major cities of the empire were not merely military highways, but commercial arteries that facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas across vast distances. Agricultural policies of the regime were equally sophisticated, based on a scientific understanding of soil management and crop rotation that maximized yields while preserving the long-term fertility of the land. The irrigation systems that had been restored under Uruk were expanded and improved, bringing thousands of additional acres into productive use. The king established agricultural colleges where farmers could learn new techniques and experiment with different crops, creating a system of knowledge transfer that ensured continuous improvement in agricultural productivity. The cultural achievements of Shulgi's reign were perhaps even more significant than his administrative and economic successes. The king was a patron of the arts on a scale that had never been attempted before, supporting not only the traditional crafts of metalworking and sculpture, but also the newer arts of literature and music. The royal court became a center of cultural innovation where artists from different traditions could meet and exchange ideas, creating new forms of expression that synthesized the best elements of various cultural traditions. The literary production of the period was particularly remarkable, with works that combined the mythological themes of traditional Sumerian culture with new forms of historical and philosophical writing. Shulgi himself was a skilled poet, whose hymns reveal a complex understanding of the relationship between human and divine authority. His compositions were not merely royal propaganda, but genuine works of art that explored the deepest questions of human existence, the nature of justice, the meaning of mortality, and the proper relationship between the individual and the community. The religious policies of Shulgi's reign reflected his understanding that spiritual authority was as important as political power in maintaining the cohesion of the empire. The king was careful to present himself not as a rival to the gods, but as their faithful servant, chosen to implement divine will in the human sphere. The elaborate religious ceremonies that marked the major festivals of the year were not merely displays of royal power, but genuine acts of worship that reinforced the sacred foundations of political authority. The temple complexes that were built during Shulgi's reign represented the pinnacle of Sumerian architectural achievement. The great ziggurat of Uruk was expanded and beautified, its terraces planted with gardens that created a vision of paradise on earth. Similar projects were undertaken in other cities, creating a network of sacred architecture that unified the empire both spiritually and politically. These buildings were not merely monuments to royal ego, but functional centers of religious and economic life that served the needs of the entire community. The international relations of Shulgi's reign were marked by a sophistication that reflected the king's understanding of the changing nature of power in the ancient world. Rather than relying solely on military force to maintain his authority, Shulgi created a complex system of alliances and tributary relationships that extended Sumerian influence far beyond the borders of the empire. His diplomatic correspondence, preserved in the royal archives, reveals a master of statecraft who understood that lasting security required not just military strength, but the patient cultivation of mutual interests and shared values. The military innovations of Shulgi's reign were equally significant, though they reflected his preference for defensive rather than offensive strategies. The king created a professional army that was not merely a tool of conquest, but a force for maintaining internal order and protecting the empire from external threats. The sophisticated fortification systems that were built during his reign, with their complex arrangements of walls, towers, and gates, represented the most advanced military architecture of the ancient world. Perhaps most remarkably, Shulgi understood that the greatest threat to his empire came not from external enemies, but from the internal contradictions that had destroyed previous attempts at unification. He worked constantly to balance the competing demands of central authority and local autonomy, creating a system of government that was flexible enough to accommodate regional differences while maintaining the unity necessary for effective administration. His success in achieving this balance was perhaps his greatest achievement, creating a model of governance that would influence political thought for centuries to come. The personal qualities that made Shulgi such an effective ruler were as remarkable as his public achievements. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man of extraordinary intelligence and energy, capable of mastering the complex details of administration while maintaining a broad vision of the goals he hoped to achieve. He was also a skilled athlete and musician, qualities that endeared him to his subjects and demonstrated that royal authority could be combined with personal excellence in all areas of human endeavors. Shulgi's long reign drew toward its close. The empire he had created stood at the pinnacle of its power and influence. The cities of Mesopotamia had never been more prosperous. The agricultural system had never been more productive, and the cultural achievements of the period had never been more impressive. Yet the king who had accomplished so much remained aware of the transitory nature of human achievement. Knowing that even the greatest empires must eventually pass away, the institutions he had created, the laws he had promulgated, and the culture he had fostered would provide the foundation for his successors. But the ultimate test of his legacy would come only with the passage of time and the challenges that lay ahead. The death of Shulgi in his palace at Ur marked the end of an era, but not the end of the dynasty. He had done so much to strengthen his successors, would inherit a kingdom that was stronger, more prosperous, and more culturally sophisticated than any that had preceded it. Yet they would also inherit the challenges that come with greatness, the burden of maintaining institutions that had grown complex and sophisticated, the difficulty of preserving unity in an empire that had become vast and diverse, and the constant pressure of external forces that sought to exploit any sign of weakness or division. The legacy of Shulgi's reign would extend far beyond the borders of his own kingdom and the span of his own dynasty. The administrative innovations he had pioneered would influence the development of government throughout the ancient world, while the legal principles he had established would provide a foundation for centuries of jurisprudential development. Most importantly, perhaps, his reign had demonstrated that it was possible to create a form of government that combined effective administration with respect for human dignity, practical wisdom with philosophical depth, and temporal power with spiritual authority. In achieving this synthesis, Shulgi had created not just a successful empire, but a model of what human civilization could aspire to become. The golden age that Shulgi had created would not last forever, but its achievements would never be entirely forgotten in the generations that followed. As new powers arose and old empires fell, the memory of what had been accomplished during those 48 years of wise rule would continue to inspire those who dreamed of creating a better world. And in the quiet chambers of the temples, where the priests continued their ancient vigils, the records of Shulgi's achievements would be preserved for future generations to study and admire, a testament to the heights that human civilization had once achieved in the ancient land between the rivers. The reign of Shulgi represented not just the pinnacle of Sumerian achievement, but the culmination of a tradition of kingship that had evolved over centuries of trial and error. From the legendary rulers of the earliest city-states to the sophisticated administrators of the third dynasty of yore, each generation had contributed something to the development of this tradition, building upon the achievements of their predecessors while adapting to the challenges of their own time. In Shulgi, this tradition had found its most perfect expression, creating a form of rule that combined all the best elements of Sumerian political thought with the practical wisdom necessary for effective governance. The scribes worked through the darkening hours, their reed stylus pressing cuneiform marks into clay tablets that would outlast the very kingdoms they recorded in the halls of where Ishbiera's descendants struggled to maintain the illusion of Sumerian continuity. The weight of 5,000 years pressed down like the accumulated silt of countless floods. The third dynasty of yore had fallen, its last king Ibisin taken in chains to distant Elam. Yet something profound persisted in the rhythmic scratch of writing, in the careful preservation of laws that had governed humanity since the dawn of city-slipper Ishtar. The fifth ruler of the Asin dynasty understood that kingship had become something different from what it had been in the days of Gilgamesh or even Ur-Nammu. The Amorites pressed from the west, their tribal ways alien to the ordered world of irrigation canals and temple hierarchies in the south. Lhasa grew strong under kings who honored Sumerian gods but spoke with accents that revealed their foreign birth. The political map of southern Mesopotamia had shattered into competing fragments, each claiming legitimacy through connection to the ancient traditions, yet none possessing the unified authority that had once flowed from Ur in his palace at Isin. Lipitishtar commissioned scholars to compile a new law code, drawing upon the precedents established by Ur-Nammu, but adapted to the realities of a more fractured world. The prologue spoke of justice for widow and orphan, of the king as shepherd of his people, using language that echoed across millennia of royal proclamations. Yet beneath these eternal formulations lay the recognition that the age of great empire had passed, that kingship now meant the careful management of decline rather than the bold expansion of power. The astronomical observations continued, star watchers in temple towers recording the movements of celestial bodies with the same precision their predecessors had employed for 1,500 years. The mathematics of the cosmos remained unchanged. The geometric relationships that governed the construction of ziggurats, as valid as they had been when Ur-Nammu first ordered massive temples raised to touch the sky. Knowledge persisted even as political authority crumbled, carried forward by individuals who understood that their true loyalty lay not to any particular dynasty but to the accumulated wisdom of their civilization. In the archives of Nippur, where the god Enlil had been worshipped since the earliest days of Sumerian settlement, Scholars copied and recopied the epic tales that had grown around the memory of ancient kings. The story of Gilgamesh expanded with each telling. New adventures added to the core narrative of friendship and loss, of the hero's futile quest for immortality. The historical king of Uruk, who had ruled for perhaps 27 years in the 27th century before the Common Era, became a figure of universal human significance. His struggles with mortality speaking to emotions that transcended the particular circumstances of any single culture or period. The scribes who preserved these tales understood that they were engaging in a form of rebellion against time itself. In a world where cities rose and fell with the regularity of seasonal floods, where dynasties succeeded each other in endless cycles of conquest and collapse, the written word offered a different kind of immortality. The clay tablets that filled the temple archives might survive the destruction of the buildings that housed them, carrying forward the voices of the dead to speak to generations. Yet unborn Hammurabi ascended to the throne of Babylon in 1792 BCE, inheriting a city that had been little more than a provincial town during the height of Sumerian power. Yet, within the span of his 43-year reign, this previously insignificant settlement would become the center of an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia. The Amorite king understood that military conquest alone would not suffice to hold such diverse territories together. He would need to become the heir to Sumerian civilization, even as he transformed it according to his own vision, the code of laws that bears. Hammurabi's name drew extensively upon Sumerian precedents, incorporating provisions from the codes of Yonamu and Lipitishtar, while adding innovations that reflected the more complex society of the second millennium. The principle of proportional justice, the careful gradation of punishments according to social status, the detailed regulations governing trade and agricultural, these elements had been present in Sumerian law for centuries. Yet Hammurabi's code possessed a comprehensiveness and systematic organization that marked it as the product of a more sophisticated legal culture. The stele on which the code was inscribed showed the king receiving the symbols of justice from the god Shamash, a divine legitimation that echoed the ancient Sumerian understanding of kingship as a sacred trust. Yet the god depicted was not Enlil or An, the great deities of the Sumerian pantheon, but Shamash, the Akkadian and Babylonian god of justice. The cultural synthesis that had been developing for centuries reached its mature form in Hammurabi's reign, creating a civilization that was neither purely Sumerian nor purely Semitic, but something new, born from the marriage of different traditions in the schools of Babylon. Young scribes learned to write not only in Akkadian but in Sumerian as well, studying the ancient language as scholars in later centuries would study Latin or Greek. The hymns and prayers composed for temple ceremonies drew upon Sumerian religious formulas, adapting them to honor gods whose names might be different but whose essential nature remained unchanged. The great creation myth, Enuma Elish, with its account of the primordial struggle between order and chaos, bore clear traces of Sumerian cosmology, while presenting a narrative that placed the Babylonian god Marduk at the center of cosmic authority. The economic systems that supported Hammurabi's empire remained fundamentally Sumerian in character. The network of canals that brought water to the fields, the elaborate bureaucracy that managed state resources, the guilds of craftsmen who produced goods for local consumption and long-distance trade. All these institutions had their roots in the innovations of the third millennium. The palace archives at Babylon, written in the cuneiform script that had been developed by Sumerian scribes centuries earlier, recorded transactions that would have been familiar to administrators in the time of Gudea or Yurnamuyet. Something essential had been lost in the transition from Sumerian to Babylonian rule, the intimate connection between king and city that had characterized the early dynastic period gave way to a more remote form of authority, one that relied upon professional bureaucrats and standing armies rather than the direct participation of citizens in governance. The temple remained important, but it no longer served as the primary center of economic and political life. The king was still the earthly representative of the gods, but the gods themselves had become more distant. They were mediated through complex hierarchies of priests and officials in the villages of the south, where the descendants of the ancient Sumerians continued to tend their fields and fish the marshes of the delta. The old ways persisted with remarkable tenacity. The agricultural calendar remained tied to the movements of the stars. The festivals of planting and harvest celebrated according to traditions that reached back to the earliest days of settlement. The goddess Inanna, though she might now be called Ishtar, still received offerings of bread and beer from women who understood that fertility and abundance depended upon her. Favor, the rise of Assyria in the first millennium BCE, marked another transformation in the political landscape of Mesopotamia, one that would push the memory of independent Sumerian kingship even further into the past. The Assyrian monarchs, with their capital at Nineveh, ruled an empire that dwarfed even the achievements of Hammurabi, stretching from Egypt to Iran, from the mountains of Armenia to the shores of the Persian Gulf. Yet these conquerors, for all their military might, recognized the cultural authority of the south. The region they called the land of Akkad and Sumer-Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, established a library at Nineveh that contained thousands of cuneiform tablets, many of them copies of Sumerian texts that had been preserved in the schools and temples of Babylon. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the creation myths, the hymns to ancient gods all found their way into the royal collection, where they were studied by scribes who understood that these works represented the foundation of Mesopotamian literary culture. The Assyrian king, descendant of nomadic tribes who had learned the arts of civilization from their southern neighbors, became the patron of a scholarly enterprise that preserved the intellectual heritage of Sumer for future generations. The political independence of the Sumerian city-states had ended more than 1,000 years earlier, yet the cultural influence of Sumerian civilization continued to shape the societies that claimed dominion over the ancient homeland. The cuneiform script, refined and adapted by countless generations of scribes, remained the primary medium of written communication throughout the Near East. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge developed in Sumerian schools provided the foundation for scientific investigations that would eventually influence Greek and Islamic scholarship in the Temple of Marduk at Babylon. The New Year festival continued to be celebrated according to rituals that preserved elements of Sumerian religious practice. The king's participation in these ceremonies, his symbolic marriage to the goddess, his ritual humiliation and restoration, these elements echoed the sacred kingship of the third millennium. Adapted to serve the needs of a different age, the gods might bear different names. The political structures might have evolved beyond recognition, yet the fundamental understanding of royal authority as a sacred trust remained largely unchanged. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE brought yet another foreign dynasty to power in Mesopotamia. Yet the new rulers showed remarkable respect for local traditions. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, took care to honor the ancient gods of Babylon, presenting himself as their chosen agent Rather than as a foreign conqueror, the cuneiform inscriptions that recorded his deeds employed the same formulaic language that had been used by Mesopotamian kings for 2 millennia, creating a sense of continuity that transcended the dramatic political changes of the 6th century in the villages of the south, where the irrigation canals still followed courses laid out by Sumerian engineers. The rhythms of agricultural life continued with minimal disruption. The farmers who worked these fields might acknowledge Persian overlords, but their daily existence remained governed by the same environmental constraints that had shaped their ancestors' lives for thousands of years: the annual flood, the cycles of planting and harvest, the careful maintenance of water rights. These concerns transcended political boundaries, creating a form of cultural continuity that survived the rise and fall of empires. The scribal schools of Babylon continued to teach Sumerian as a learned language, much as Latin would later be taught in medieval Europe. Young men who aspired to careers in temple administration or royal service spent years mastering the complex grammar and vocabulary of the ancient tongue, copying out literary texts that had been transmitted through dozens of generations. The tradition of scholarship that had begun in the schools of Nippur and Yor persisted through successive waves of conquest, adapting to new circumstances while preserving essential elements of the cultural heritage. The arrival of Alexander the Great in Babylon in 331 BCE marked the beginning of the end for the cuneiform tradition that had preserved Sumerian culture for 3 millennia. The Macedonian conqueror, though he showed respect for local customs and even participated in traditional religious ceremonies, brought with him a different way of organizing knowledge and power. The Greek language, written in alphabetic script, gradually displaced cuneiform. As the medium of official communication, the scholars who had once studied Sumerian literature turned their attention to Greek philosophy and science. Yet, the influence of Sumerian civilization extended far beyond the narrow confines of scribal education. The legal concepts that had been developed in the courts of Yor and Babylon found their way into Roman law, which in turn shaped the legal systems of medieval and modern Europe. The mathematical principles discovered by Sumerian astronomers contributed to the development of Greek geometry and trigonometry. The literary themes explored in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the nature of friendship, the inevitability of death, the proper relationship between humans and gods, became part of the universal heritage of human culture. The last cuneiform tablet was inscribed sometime in the 1st century of the Common Era, more than 3,000 years after the script had been invented by Sumerian scribes. The temple schools that had nurtured this tradition for so many centuries had finally closed, their pupils scattered to pursue careers in a world that no longer valued the ancient learning. The ziggurats that had dominated the landscape of southern Mesopotamia stood empty, their massive walls slowly crumbling under the assault of wind and rain. The gods who had once received daily offerings in these temples were forgotten, their names preserved only in the tablets that molded in abandoned archives. The physical traces of Sumerian civilization gradually disappeared beneath the accumulated deposits of later ages. The cities that had witnessed the reigns of Gilgamesh and Yornemu became tells, artificial hills that marked the location of ancient settlements. The irrigation canals that had sustained intensive agriculture for millennia silted up, transforming fertile fields into desert. The population that had once supported dozens of city-states dwindled to a handful of villages, their inhabitants unaware of the great civilization that had once flourished in their homeland. Yet something of the Sumerian achievement persisted in ways that transcended the mere preservation of written records. The urban civilization that had first emerged in the cities of Sumer provided the model for all subsequent attempts to organize large populations in complex societies. The concept of written law, the notion of divine kingship, the idea that human beings could reshape their environment through organized effort. All these fundamental aspects of civilized life had their origins in the innovations of the 4th and 3rd millennia BC Ether. Religious concepts that had been developed in Sumerian theology continued to influence human thought long after the last temple had been abandoned. The understanding of the divine as simultaneously transcendent and immanent. The notion that cosmic order depended upon the proper performance of ritual obligations. The belief that earthly rulers derived their authority from heavenly powers. These ideas found expression in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the monotheistic religions that would eventually dominate the cultural landscape of the Near East in the Islamic period. When Arab scholars began to explore the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, they found inscriptions in a script they could not read, commemorating the deeds of kings whose names they did not know. The local inhabitants spoke of the ruins as the work of jinn, supernatural beings who had possessed the power to build on a scale that seemed impossible for mere mortals. The memory of the great kings who had once ruled these lands had faded into legend. Their historical achievements transformed into mythical tales that bore little resemblance to the original reality. The excavations that began in the 19th century of the Common Era gradually revealed the extent of Sumerian achievement to a world that had forgotten their very existence. The patient work of archaeologists, slowly uncovering the buried cities of Mesopotamia, brought to light the palaces and temples, the archives and workshops, the art and literature of a civilization that had vanished from human memory for nearly 2 millennia. The decipherment of cuneiform script allowed scholars to read the words of Sumerian kings, to understand their laws and their legends, to appreciate the complexity of their thought and the sophistication of their institutions. The rediscovery of Sumerian civilization came at a time when the modern world was grappling with many of the same challenges that had confronted the ancient kings: the problems of urban governance, the management of scarce resources, the maintenance of social order in complex societies. These concerns were as relevant to the 20th century as they had been to the 3rd millennium BCE. The solutions developed by Sumerian administrators, though adapted to very different circumstances, offered insights that remained valuable after 5,000 years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, translated into dozens of modern languages, found new audiences who recognized in the ancient heroes' struggles, their own confrontation with mortality and meaning, the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the hero's grief at his companion's death, his futile quest for immortality. These themes spoke to universal human experiences that transcended the particular circumstances of ancient Mesopotamia. The poem that had been composed to honor a king of Uruk became a meditation on the human condition that resonated across cultures and centuries. The legal principles that had been codified in the laws of Yorinamu and Hammurabi continued to influence legal thinking in the modern world. The concept of proportional justice, the protection of the weak against the strong, the notion that law should serve the common good rather than the narrow interests of the powerful. These ideas, first articulated in cuneiform inscriptions, became part of the foundation of modern jurisprudence. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone nearly 4,000 years ago, was cited in debates about human rights and social justice in the 20th century. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge preserved in Sumerian texts contributed to the development of modern science. The base 60 number system, the division of the circle into 360 degrees, The measurement of time in units of 60 seconds and 60 minutes. These innovations, developed by Sumerian scribes and astronomers, remained fundamental to mathematical calculation and timekeeping. The careful observations of planetary movements recorded in temple archives provided data that helped modern astronomers understand the history of the solar system. The agricultural techniques developed in the irrigated fields of Mesopotamia offered lessons for modern efforts to increase food production in arid regions. The methods of canal construction, the principles of water management, the crops that had been cultivated in the ancient fields. All these elements of Sumerian farming practice found new applications in contemporary agricultural projects. The civilization that had transformed the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia into one of the world's first agricultural surplus regions provided models for similar transformations in other parts of the world. Religious and philosophical concepts that had been developed in Sumerian temples continued to influence human thought in subtle but profound ways. The understanding of human beings as creatures suspended between earth and heaven, neither fully divine nor merely animal, had shaped Western theology and philosophy for millennia. The notion that earthly life was meaningful only in relation to transcendent values, that individual existence gained significance through participation in larger cosmic processes. These ideas, first articulated in Sumerian religious texts, remained central to human self-understanding. Political institutions that had been developed in the Sumerian city-states provided precedents for modern experiments in democratic governance. The assemblies of citizens that had advised early kings, the councils of elders that had mediated disputes, the notion that rulers were accountable to their subjects. These concepts, though they had evolved through many transformations, contributed to the development of representative government. The city-state itself, as a form of political organization that balanced local autonomy with broader cooperation, offered a model that remained relevant to contemporary discussions of federalism and international relations. In the museums of the modern world, the artifacts of Sumerian civilization rest in climate-controlled cases, their cuneiform inscriptions translated and catalogued, their historical significance explained to visitors who pause briefly before moving on to the next display. The golden helmet of Mescalamdeg, the silver lyre from the royal cemetery at your statue of Gudea, with his hands folded in eternal prayer. These objects, torn from their original contexts, speak to a different age about the achievements of a vanished world. The kings who commissioned these works, who wore these crowns and heard these instruments played in their honor, have become names in scholarly monographs, their deeds reduced. 2 footnotes in the history of civilization. The tales that mark the sites of ancient cities rise above the modern landscape of Uruk, like monuments to forgotten glory. Uruk, where Gilgamesh once ruled, is now a collection of ruined walls and collapsed buildings. Visited occasionally by archaeologists and academic tourists, the ziggurat of Yots, partially reconstructed in the 20th century, stands as a testament to architectural ambition that has outlasted the society that created it. The canals that once brought life to this desert region are filled with sand and rubble, their precise engineering gradually erased by the passage of time. The descendants of the ancient Sumerians, if any such people still exist, live in modern Iraq and Iran. Their languages and customs, shaped by centuries of cultural mixing and historical change, the Arabic and Persian tongues that are spoken in the region today, bear no resemblance to the Sumerian language that was once the medium of literature and learning. The Islamic faith that dominates the religious landscape would be as alien to the ancient inhabitants as their polytheistic worship would be to contemporary believers. The continuity of human settlement in the region masks the profound transformation that has occurred over the course of 5 millennia in the quiet of libraries and universities. Scholars continue to study the cuneiform tablets that preserve the words of Sumerian kings. New discoveries occasionally emerge from the archaeological record, adding details to our understanding of ancient politics and culture. The translation of previously unknown texts sometimes reveals aspects of Sumerian life that had been lost to history. The work of interpretation continues, each generation of scholars bringing new questions and methodologies to the study of the ancient world. Influence of Sumerian civilization on the modern world is so pervasive that it has become largely invisible, the city as a form of human organization. The concept of written law, the notion of divine kingship, the practice of monumental architecture, these elements of contemporary culture can be traced back to innovations that occurred in the cities of ancient Sumer. The mathematical principles that govern modern engineering, the astronomical knowledge that guides space exploration, the legal concepts that structure international relations will bear the imprint of discoveries made by Sumerian scribes and administrators 5,000 years ago there. Stories that were told about the ancient kings have been transformed by countless retellings into archetypes that continue to shape human imagination. The figure of the wise ruler, the just lawgiver, the heroic warrior, these roles, first embodied by Sumerian monarchs, have become part of the universal grammar of political power. The tensions between individual ambition and social responsibility, between earthly achievement and cosmic significance, between the demands of the present and the claims of eternity. These themes, explored in Sumerian literature, remain central to human self-understanding. Archaeological record suggests that Sumerian civilization was neither more nor less humane than the societies that succeeded it. The evidence of warfare and slavery, of social inequality and environmental degradation, reminds us that the ancient world was marked by the same moral complexities that characterize the modern era. The kings who ruled these ancient cities were neither paragons of virtue nor monsters of cruelty, but human beings who exercised power within the constraints of their time and place. Their achievements and failures offer lessons about the possibilities and limitations of human organization, rather than simple models to be emulated or avoided. The quest for immortality that drove Gilgamesh through his legendary adventures has become a metaphor for humanity's struggle against the limitations of mortal existence. The epic that was composed to honor a king of Uruk has been read as a meditation on the human condition, an exploration of the meaning of life in the face of inevitable death. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the hero's grief at his companion's passing, his journey to the ends of the earth in search of eternal life. These elements of the ancient story continue to resonate with readers who recognize in the Sumerian king's quest their own confrontation with mortality. The historical Gilgamesh, who probably ruled Uruk in the 27th century BCE, achieved a form of immortality that he could never have imagined. His name and deeds, preserved in the collective memory of his people, survived the destruction of his city and the disappearance of his civilization. The epic that grew around his memory became one of the foundational texts of world literature, studied and translated by scholars who lived thousands of years after the last Sumerian king had died. The immortality that eluded the hero in life was granted to him through the power of storytelling, the ability of human beings to preserve meaning. Across the generations, the other kings of Sumer achieved their own forms of lasting significance through the institutions they created and the precedents they established. Ur-Nummu's law code, though it was superseded by later legal developments, provided a model for the codification of justice that influenced legal thinking for millennia. Gudia's architectural projects, though the buildings themselves have long since crumbled, established principles of monumental construction that can be seen in structures around the world. Sargon's empire, though it lasted less than 2 centuries, created the template for imperial organization that would be copied by countless subsequent conquerors. The agricultural innovations that were developed in the fields of Mesopotamia provided the foundation for the surplus production that made urban civilization possible. The techniques of irrigation, the domestication of crops, the organization of labor, these achievements, though they are rarely attributed to individual rulers, represent the collective accomplishment of the Sumerian people. The transformation of the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia into one of the world's first agricultural surplus regions required the coordinated efforts of thousands of individuals over many generations. The kings who oversaw this process were the visible symbols of a social achievement that transcended any individual contribution. The religious concepts that were developed in Sumerian temples provided the foundation for humanity's understanding of the divine and the sacred, the notion of gods who were simultaneously transcendent and immanent, the understanding of ritual as a means of maintaining cosmic order, the belief that earthly existence was meaningful only in relation to higher purposes. These ideas, first articulated in Sumerian theology, became part of the universal heritage of human spirituality. The specific deities who were worshipped in ancient Mesopotamia may have been forgotten, but the religious sensibility that they embodied continues to influence human thought. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge that was preserved in Sumerian texts contributed to the development of science and technology that has transformed human life. The basic number system, the principles of geometry, the careful observation of celestial movements, these innovations, developed by Sumerian scribes and astronomers, provided the foundation for scientific discoveries that continue to expand human knowledge. The instruments of precision that were created in ancient workshops, the methods of calculation that were developed in temple schools, the records of natural phenomena that were preserved in archives, all these elements of Sumerian learning contributed to the accumulation of knowledge that has enabled humanity to understand and manipulate the natural world. The political institutions that were developed in the Sumerian city-states provided precedents for the organization of human society that remain relevant to contemporary challenges. The balance between central authority and local autonomy, the relationship between rulers and subjects, the mechanisms for resolving disputes and maintaining order. These concerns, first addressed in the palaces of ancient Mesopotamia, continue to shape political thinking in the modern world. The experiments in governance that were conducted in the city-states of Sumer provided lessons about the possibilities and limitations of human organization that transcend the particular circumstances of any single historical period. The burden of preserving the memory of the ancient kings fell to the scribes who copied their texts and the scholars who studied their remains in the libraries of the modern world. The cuneiform tablets that record the deeds of Sumerian rulers gathered dust on forgotten shelves, their contents known only to a handful of specialists who have devoted their lives to understanding a vanished civilization. The languages that were once spoken in the markets and temples of Mesopotamia are now the province of academic study, their grammar and vocabulary preserved in scholarly dictionaries and textbooks. Process of historical interpretation has transformed the Sumerian kings from living individuals into abstract symbols of human achievement and failure. The complex personalities who once ruled these ancient cities, with their individual quirks and private struggles, have been reduced to the roles they played in the grand narrative of civilization. Gilgamesh has become the archetypal hero, Hammurabi the lawgiver, Sargon the Conqueror, the rich texture of human experience that characterized their actual lives, has been simplified to serve the needs of historical analysis. The archaeological record provides tantalizing glimpses of the world that these kings inhabited, but it can never fully recreate the experience of living in ancient Mesopotamia. The palaces and temples that have been excavated offer evidence of architectural sophistication and artistic achievement, but they cannot convey the sounds and smells, the daily routines and private thoughts that gave meaning to the lives of their original inhabitants. The cuneiform texts that preserved the words of ancient rulers provide access to their public pronouncements, but they reveal little about their personal motivations and inner experiences. Gap between the historical record and the lived experience of the past creates space for imagination and speculation. The stories that have been told about the Sumerian kings, from the ancient epics to modern historical novels, attempt to bridge this gap by creating plausible narratives that bring the distant past to life. These reconstructions, however careful and scholarly they may be, inevitably reflect the concerns and assumptions of their creators rather than the actual thoughts and feelings of the ancient subjects they purport to describe. The modern fascination with ancient Mesopotamia reveals as much about contemporary preoccupations as it does about historical reality. The search for the origins of civilization, the quest to understand the foundations of human society, the desire to find meaning in the sweep of historical change. These concerns shape the questions that scholars ask about the Sumerian past and the interpretations they propose. The kings of ancient Sumer have become vehicles for exploring contemporary anxieties about power and authority, progress and decline, the relationship between individual agency and historical forces. The preservation of Sumerian civilization in museums and universities represents a form of cultural immortality that the ancient kings could never have imagined. Their artifacts and texts, removed from their original contexts and displayed for educational purposes, continue to speak to new generations about the achievements of the ancient world. The physical objects that once surrounded the daily lives of rulers and subjects have become sources of information about the past, their original functions transformed by the passage of time and the changing needs of human knowledge. The influence of Sumerian civilization on the modern world is so pervasive that it has become largely invisible. The institutions and concepts that were developed in ancient Mesopotamia have been so thoroughly integrated into contemporary culture that their origins are rarely acknowledged. The written word, the wheel, the city, the law, these fundamental aspects of human civilization were either invented or refined in the cities of ancient Sumer, yet their connection to the specific kings and cultures that created them has been obscured by the passage of time and the accumulation of subsequent innovation. Legacy of the Sumerian kings extends far beyond the material achievements that can be catalogued in museums and textbooks. Their most enduring contribution may be the demonstration that human beings are capable of creating complex, sophisticated societies that can persist across many generations. The cities they built, the laws they promulgated, the literature they sponsored, these achievements provide evidence of human creativity and organizational capacity that continues to inspire and challenge contemporary efforts to address the problems of social existence. The wind that sweeps across the ruins of ancient Uruk carries with it the dust of 5,000 years, the accumulated sediment of a civilization that once commanded the attention of the known world. The tells that marked the sites of Sumerian cities rise like islands in a sea of sand, their artificial height a testament to the countless generations who lived and died in the same locations. The bricks that were molded from the clay of the Tigris and Euphrates have returned to the earth from which they came, their careful arrangement dissolved by the patient work of wind and rain in the silence of the desert, where the voices of ancient kings once echoed through palace halls and temple courts. Only the cry of birds and the whisper of wind through broken walls remain the ziggurat of yore, partially restored by modern archaeologists, stands as a monument to architectural ambition that has outlasted the society that created it. The massive platform, built to raise the temple closer to the heavens, serves now as a viewing point for tourists who come to marvel at the achievements of a vanished world. The irrigation canals that once brought life to this arid region are traced now only by faint depressions in the landscape, their precise engineering gradually erased by the accumulation of sand and the shift of ancient watercourses. The fields that fed the populations of dozen cities have returned to desert, their fertility lost when the complex systems of water management that sustained them were abandoned. The environmental transformation that enabled the first urban civilization has been reversed, the landscape returning to something resembling its original state. The gods who once received daily offerings in the temples of Sumer have been forgotten, their names preserved only in the cuneiform texts that scholars struggle to decipher, the rituals that were performed in their honor, the festivals that celebrated their powers, the myths that explained their relationships. All these elements of ancient religious life have vanished as completely as the buildings that housed them. The sacred calendar that once regulated the rhythm of communal life has been replaced by other systems of timekeeping that bear no resemblance to the original. The languages that were spoken in the markets and courts of ancient Mesopotamia have been silent for nearly 2 millennia, their last speakers dead and buried in graves that have themselves been forgotten. The Sumerian tongue, which was already archaic when Hammurabi ruled in Babylon, survives only in the academic exercises of scholars who study it as a key to understanding the ancient world, the rich vocabulary of daily life, the intimate expressions of love and loss, the casual conversations that filled the streets of ancient cities. All these aspects of human communication have been lost forever. The social structures that organized life in the Sumerian city-states have been dissolved by the passage of time, and the succession of different forms of political organization, the guilds that regulated craft production, the councils that advised rulers, the households that formed the basic units of economic life. These institutions have been replaced by others that better serve the needs of different societies. The careful balance between central authority and local autonomy that characterized Sumerian governance has been superseded by forms of political organization that reflect different assumptions about the relationship between rulers and subjects. The works of art that once decorated the palaces and temples of Sumer are scattered now in museums around the world, their original contexts lost and their cultural significance transformed by their removal from the societies that created them. The sculptures that once received worship in temple sanctuaries have become objects of aesthetic appreciation for visitors who know nothing of the religious beliefs that inspired them. The musical instruments that once accompanied religious ceremonies and royal celebrations have been reconstructed by scholars who can only guess at the melodies they once played. The knowledge that was preserved in the libraries of ancient Mesopotamia has been partially recovered through the patient work of archaeologists and philologists. Yet much remains forever lost, the texts that were written on perishable materials, the oral traditions that were never committed to writing, the practical skills that were passed down through generations of craftsmen. All these forms of human knowledge have vanished without trace. The intellectual achievements of Sumerian civilization, impressive as they were, represent only a fraction of the cultural wealth that was accumulated and then lost over the course of 3 millennia. The genetic heritage of the Sumerian people, if it can be said to have had any distinct identity, has been absorbed into the broader populations of the Middle East. Through countless generations of intermarriage and migration, the physical appearance of the ancient inhabitants of Mesopotamia, their customs and mannerisms, their ways of speaking and moving, all these aspects of human identity have been erased by the passage of time and the mixing of populations. The people who live in modern Iraq and Iran may be the biological descendants of the ancient Sumerians, but they bear no recognizable resemblance to their distant ancestors. Yet, in the vast silence that has settled over the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, something persists that transcends the material evidence of archaeological excavation: the human capacity for creating meaning from the raw materials of existence, for organizing complex societies that can persist across generations, for producing works of art and literature that speak to universal concerns. These achievements of the Sumerian people continue to inspire and challenge contemporary efforts to understand the nature of human civilization. The kings who once ruled these ancient cities have become symbols of the eternal human struggle to create order from chaos, to build institutions that can outlast individual lives, to find meaning in the face of mortality. Their names may be forgotten by all but a few scholars, their deeds reduced to footnotes in the history of civilization, yet their example continues to influence human thought about the possibilities and limitations of political authority. The tension between individual ambition and social responsibility that characterized their reigns remains as relevant to contemporary governance as it was to the administration of ancient city-states. Stories that were told about these rulers, from the epic adventures of Gilgamesh to the law codes of Hammurabi, have become part of the universal heritage of human culture. The themes they explored, the nature of friendship, the inevitability of death, the proper relationship between earthly power and cosmic order, continue to resonate with readers who recognize in these ancient narratives their own confrontation with the fundamental questions of human existence. The literary forms that were developed in Sumerian schools have evolved and adapted to serve the needs of different cultures, but their essential concerns remain unchanged. The wind that blows across the empty landscape of southern Mesopotamia carries with it the memory of all who once lived and died in these cities. Their individual stories merged into the larger narrative of human civilization. The silence that has settled over the ruins is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of completion. The quiet that follows the end of a great work, the civilization that began with the first farmers who learned to control the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates, reached its culmination in the achievements of the Sumerian kings, and their legacy continues to shape the world in ways that would have been impossible for them to imagine in the end. The true monument to the Sumerian kings is not the ruined ziggurats that dot the landscape of modern Iraq, nor the cuneiform tablets that preserve their words in museum archives, but the continuing human capacity to create meaning from the materials of existence, to build societies that can outlast individual lives, to find in the contemplation of the past a source of wisdom for the future. The silence that has settled over their ancient cities is not the silence of death, but the silence of seeds planted in the soil of time, waiting for the proper season to bloom again in forms that their planters could never have anticipated. The stars that once guided Sumerian astronomers in their calculations continue to wheel overhead, their movements as regular and predictable as they were 5,000 years ago. The mathematics that was developed to chart their courses remains valid. The principles of geometry that were discovered in ancient temples continue to govern the relationships between lines and angles, numbers and forms. The human mind that was capable of recognizing these patterns and reducing them to systematic knowledge has not changed in its essential nature, though its applications have expanded far beyond anything that the ancient scribes could have imagined. The rivers that gave life to Sumerian civilization continued to flow, their waters carrying the silt of mountains to the sea, depositing the fertile soil that made agriculture possible in this arid region. The arid region, the cycle of flood and drought that shaped the rhythm of ancient life, continues to operate according to the same natural laws that governed it in the time of the earliest kings. The environmental challenges that confronted the first urban settlements remain relevant to contemporary efforts to create sustainable societies. Though the scale and complexity of these challenges have increased dramatically, the dust that covers the ruins of ancient Uruk and your will eventually be blown away by the desert wind, revealing once again the foundations of temples and palaces, the street patterns and drainage systems that were laid out by Sumerian engineers. The patient work of archaeologists will continue to uncover new evidence of ancient life, to decipher previously unknown texts, to reconstruct the daily existence of people who lived thousands of years ago. The past will continue to speak to the present, though its voice grows fainter with each passing generation, and, in that fading voice, carried on the wind that sweeps across the empty landscape of southern Mesopotamia, the words of the ancient kings still echo, "Remember us. You who come after, remember that we built cities where only marsh had been, that we created laws where only custom had ruled, that we found meaning in the brief span of human life. Remember that we were here, that we lived and loved and died, that we struggled against the darkness and for a time held it at bay. Remember, and in remembering, honor not our names, but the human spirit that drove us to attempt the impossible, and, for a brief moment, in the vast expanse of time, to succeed. The silence deepens, but it is not empty. It is filled with the weight of all that was, all that might have been, all that continues to be possible for those who dare to dream of building something greater than themselves in the eternal twilight of memory. The legendary kings of Sumer take their place among the immortals, not because their bodies escaped the common fate of all flesh, but because their achievements transcended the limitations of individual existence to become part of the continuing story of human civilization. The wind continues to blow, carrying with it the dust of ages, the dreams of the dead, the hopes of the living. Somewhere in that endless current of air, the voices of the ancient kings whisper still, reminding all who have ears to hear that the true measure of a life is not its length, but its depth, not its duration, but its meaning, not its individual satisfaction, but its contribution to the eternal human project of creating meaning from the raw materials of existence. In the end, there is only the silence, and in the silence, the memory of all who dared to dream of immortality and found it, not in the preservation of the flesh, but in the endurance of the spirit, not in the survival of the individual, but in the continuity of the human story that began in the marshlands of Mesopotamia and continues still in every city that rises from the earth. Every law that protects the weak, every story that preserves the memory of the past for the instruction of the future. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the legendary kings of Sumer. If these ancient voices have moved you, if their stories have found a home in your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Fall Asleep to History. Help us preserve these timeless tales for future generations, just as the ancient scribes preserved them for us. Sweet dreams, and may the wisdom of the ages guide your rest.